Hello there, and welcome back. Let your mind drift tonight toward a young woman in a foreign country. Not anyone in particular. Perhaps someone you have read about, or someone you have imagined from a portrait, or simply the figure of a girl in her late teens who has been sent across a sea to marry a man she has not met, in a country whose language she does not yet speak well, in a court whose rules she has not yet learned. Imagine her in the first weeks after the wedding, in rooms she does not yet recognize as hers, with women around her who have been chosen for her by someone else. Imagine the calculations being made about her body in the rooms next to her own, the watch on her health, the watch on her diet, the watch on her monthly cycles, the watch for the first faint signs of the child the kingdom requires her to produce within the year. Imagine her at her dressing table in the mornings, knowing that her own body has, since the day she crossed the sea, become a public object. Imagine her understanding, slowly, in the privacy of her own head, that this will not be a single task, that the heir will not be enough, that after the heir there must be a spare, and after the spare a third son, and after the third son a fourth, because royal children die, and royal children die in numbers that the dynasty does not forget. Imagine the long arithmetic of a young queen who has been told, without ever quite being told, that the work of producing the next generation of the royal line is the work of her 20s and her 30s, and possibly her 40s, and that the calendar of it is not entirely hers to set. Wherever you are listening from tonight, somewhere in the histories of every royal family you have heard of, and every family you have not, there is a young woman who was once told what her body was for, sometimes by her mother, sometimes by a minister, sometimes by the long unwritten weight of an expectation no one in the room had to say aloud, because everyone in the room already knew it. The expectation of children, and the expectation of sons, and the expectation that the sons would arrive in the right order at the right intervals, at the right pace, has been the private weather of women in great houses and royal courts for as long as there have been great houses and royal courts. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from, and whether the country you are in once had a queen who was asked the same questions of her body that the queen in tonight's story was asked of hers. Whether you are here to drift into sleep, or to spend a long evening with a woman who bore 15 children to a king who needed them, and who watched her sons grow into men she did not entirely recognize, I am glad you are with me. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did, so that you never miss a story. Tonight we are going to spend the evening with a queen who lived for 74 years, and who bore 15 children to a king of England, and who is most remembered by the sort of person who watches a series on a streaming service for her dark eyes and her German accent and her gardens at Kew, and who is most forgotten by everyone else for the fact that she spent 56 years of her life being the mother of 9 sons whom history has not, by any measure of mercy, treated kindly. They were her work. They were her achievement, and they were her sorrow, and they were the long study of her old age. They were the heir, and the spare, and the third son, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth, and the seventh, and the 2 who died as small children and left a hole in the family that did not close in her lifetime, and one of them became king, and one of them became regent before being king, and one of them stood in the ancestry of the British monarchs who followed from 1910 onward, and none of them was the sort of son she had imagined when she was a girl of 17 in Mecklenburg-Strelitz, that she would one day be the mother of. She had imagined sons who were better than she got. The sons she got were the sons history was always going to give her, because she had married into a dynasty whose structural inability to produce contented princes was the oldest piece of the family business, but she had not known any of that on the morning she crossed the sea to be married, and she had to learn it one son at a time, beginning at 18 and continuing for 40 years. Her name was Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Her husband was George III of the House of Hanover, the third of his line to reign over Great Britain, and the third of his line to find that the throne was a thing more easily inherited than discharged. She would marry him at 17. She would bury him not at all, because he would outlive her by 15 months, although the man she had married had been gone from his own mind, by the end, for 8 years. She would bury 3 of her own children. She would outlive only one of her own grandchildren who was legitimate, and that grandchild would die in childbirth at 21. She would die in a chair at Kew at 74, with her eldest son holding her hand in the autumn of 1818, 6 months before the birth of a granddaughter who would become Queen Victoria and who would carry the dynasty into the century Charlotte had not lived to see. Charlotte would not know, that day in the chair at Kew, that the dynasty had been saved. She would die thinking it had not. Charlotte was born on the 19th of May, 1744, in the small palace of Miro, in the Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, in northern Germany, the 8th child and youngest daughter of a minor German duke, whose territories were so small that the duke himself ran them with the help of a single secretary and an account book. Her father died when she was 8. Her elder brother became duke. Her mother, Princess Elizabeth Albertine of Saxe-Hilberghausen, raised the surviving children in a household that practiced the small economies of minor German princely life, which were the economies of mended stockings and retrimmed gowns and dinners at which the Duke and his family ate only what the kitchen garden had produced that morning. Charlotte was educated by tutors who came in from the town. She learned French and a little Italian and the catechism of the Lutheran Church and the rudiments of music, and she did not learn English, because there had been no occasion for her to learn it, and because no one in her family had imagined that there would ever be such an occasion. She was a thin, dark-eyed girl with hair that her mother described as the colour of a chestnut, and a complexion that the same mother described as olive, which in the language of German aristocratic correspondence in the 1750s was not entirely a compliment. The portraits painted of her in the year before her marriage show a face that is not conventionally pretty by the standard of European court portraiture of the period. The chin too narrow, the lower lip too full, the eyes too large for the face. She was, in person, by the account of those who met her, animated and quick. She had a light singing voice. She was kind to servants. She was, at 16 and 17, the sort of young woman whom the older women of a provincial German court describe as a credit to her mother, and the sort of young man at the same court does not particularly notice, because at the same court there is generally a more interesting cousin, or a more dramatic visitor, or a more obviously marriageable elder sister to look at first. She would not, on her own merits, or on the merits of her family, or on the merits of her father's territories, have been considered a serious candidate for any throne in Europe. Mecklenburg-Strelitz was a duchy of perhaps 100,000 people. It produced nothing the rest of Europe wanted. It maintained no army of any consequence. Its court was so modest that the Duke and his sister attended church on Sundays at the same parish church as the local merchants. The Princess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was, by the calculus of European royal marriage in the 18th century, a girl who would marry a minor German prince of comparable obscurity and live out her life in a modest palace very much like the one she had been born in, and her name would not, in any reasonable expectation, be one that the rest of Europe would ever learn. What happened instead happened because of a letter. In the spring of 1761, the young King of Great Britain, George III, who had inherited the throne the previous October at the age of 22, was the subject of intense pressure from his mother and his ministers to marry. He had been in love since the age of 18 with Lady Sarah Lennox, a beautiful young Englishwoman of impeccable Whig family connections, and his ministers had refused to permit the match, on the grounds that an English noblewoman could not be queen and an English-born queen could not be the mother of his children, because royal marriages were political, and royal marriages had to be political, and the king's wife had to come from a Protestant European court of appropriate but not excessive consequence. The king had been told, with the icy unanimity that ministers used in the 18th century when they were certain of being obeyed, that he would marry a German princess, and that the choice of German princess would be made for him. A list was drawn up. The British envoy in Hanover, Colonel Graham, was given the list and was sent on a quiet tour of the minor Protestant courts of northern Germany to assess the candidates. The list ran to 7 names. The first 6 were the daughters of more substantial courts: Anhalt-Dessau, Brandenburg-Schwedt, Saxe-Gotha, 2 daughters of the Princess of Wolfenbüttel, 1 daughter of the Margrave of Brandenburg-Bayreuth. Each was assessed by Colonel Graham, and each was, in turn, rejected for reasons that ranged from the political to the personal. One was reported to be too tall. One was reported to be Lutheran pious in a manner the king's ministers thought inappropriate for an English queen. One had a brother whose politics were considered unsound. One was reported to have an opinion on the war with France, which was disqualifying because a Queen of England was not meant to have opinions on wars. One was thought to be plain in a way that would not photograph well in the official wedding portraiture, which is not how the criterion was expressed in 1761, but is the modern equivalent. The 7th name on the list was Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She was on the list because Mecklenburg-Strelitz was small and Protestant, and her brother was not politically active, and her family had no powerful relatives who would interfere with her in England. She was on the list, in other words, because she was nobody. The British minister assessed her in late spring of 1761, in a brief audience at the modest palace at Strelitz. He reported that she was 17, that she was healthy, that she had been raised by her mother in habits of modesty and economy, that she spoke French adequately, that her German was the standard High German of the courts and not the regional dialect of the duchy, that she was musically educated, and that she was, in his judgment, a young woman of even temper and apparent good sense. He also reported, in a single sentence near the end of the report, that the princess had remarked, in the audience, that she would prefer to remain in Germany. The report was sent to London. The king read it in early July. He had not, by this point, seen Charlotte's portrait. He had been shown only a profile drawing of her, which had been made hurriedly by a court painter at Strelitz, and which was not, by later accounts, an accurate likeness. The marriage was agreed on the 8th of July, 1761, in a meeting of the Privy Council at St. James's. Charlotte was informed on the 17th, by a letter delivered to her mother at Strelitz, that she had been chosen to be the next Queen of Great Britain, and that her marriage and coronation were to take place in London in September, and that arrangements were already being made to bring her across the sea. The letter was the first she had heard of any of it. She had 8 weeks. She did not speak English. She did not know London. She did not know the man she was to marry. She was 17 years old, and the rest of her life had been arranged for her in 3 weeks by men she had never met, on the basis of a report she had never read, by a king she would not see until the day of her wedding. She was married on the 8th of September, 1761, in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, at 9 o'clock in the evening, after a sea crossing of 11 days that had nearly sunk her ship in a Channel storm, and that had left her, when she landed at Harwich, so green with seasickness that she could not stand up unassisted on the quay. She was driven to London by carriage on the 7th of September. She met the king at the gate of St. James's at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 8th. She was introduced to her future mother-in-law, Augusta, the Dowager Princess of Wales, and to the king's sisters. She was given a brief tour of the apartments that had been prepared for her. She was dressed for the wedding by women she had not met before, in a gown of silver tissue that had been made to measurements that her mother had sent on ahead. She was married, in French and Latin, to a man she had spoken perhaps 200 words to since the moment of meeting him 6 hours earlier. The marriage was consummated that night in the apartments of St. James's. The coronation took place 2 weeks later, on the 22nd of September, in Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony of such length and such heat that one of her ladies fainted in the carriage on the way home. The kingdom had its queen. The queen was 17. The kingdom waited for what was supposed to come next, which was an heir, and which was expected within the year, because the kingdom had been waiting for an heir of this line for 2 reigns, and because the queen's body had been the subject of the negotiation in a manner that everyone in the rooms next to hers understood, even if no one in the rooms with her said it aloud. To understand what the kingdom was waiting for, it is necessary to understand what kind of dynasty Charlotte had married into. She did not understand it on the morning of her wedding. She would come to understand it across the next 40 years, one revelation at a time. But the dynasty itself, by the autumn of 1761, was one of the most structurally anxious royal families in Europe, and the anxiety was about sons. The House of Hanover had come to the British throne in 1714 by the legal accident of an Act of Parliament. The previous dynasty, the Stuarts, had lost the throne in 1688 in the revolution that historians would later call glorious, and the cause of the loss had been a son. King James II, the last Stuart king, had been a Catholic, and his subjects had tolerated his Catholicism on the understanding that his Protestant elder daughters by his first marriage would inherit, and the Catholic faith would not pass into the next generation. In 1688, James's second wife had given birth to a son who was unambiguously Catholic, and who unambiguously took precedence over his Protestant half-sisters. The country had revolted. James had fled to France. His Protestant daughter Mary, with her Dutch husband William, had taken the throne. The Stuart line, with the Catholic son in exile, had ended in Britain, although it had continued in France and in Italy, and the exiled Stuart claimants, the old pretender and his son the young pretender, would haunt the British political imagination for the next 60 years. The throne had been lost over a son. The whole subsequent legal architecture of the British monarchy had been built to make sure such a loss could not happen again. Mary II died childless in 1694. Her husband William III reigned alone and died childless in 1702. The throne passed to Mary's younger sister Anne, who reigned until 1714. Queen Anne had been pregnant 17 times. She had buried every one of her pregnancies and every one of her children. The longest surviving had been William, Duke of Gloucester, who had died at the age of 11 in 1700, after a brief illness, and whose death had set off a national crisis because there was no Protestant heir of the Stuart line in any direct succession beyond him. Parliament had passed the Act of Settlement in 1701, which had established that on Anne's death the throne would pass not to her Catholic Stuart relatives in France, but to the nearest Protestant relatives, the electors of Hanover in northern Germany, who were descended from a granddaughter of James I. The Hanoverian succession, in other words, had been arranged by Parliament in 1701 because the Stuart line had failed to produce a Protestant son who lived to inherit, and the dynasty Charlotte had married into in 1761 was on the throne fundamentally because of a Stuart child who had died at 11. The Hanoverians, who had come over in 1714, were a small German house with a long memory and an unforgiving sense of dynastic risk. George I, the first Hanoverian king, had hated his eldest son. The hatred had been visible. The son had lived in a separate household, had held a rival court at Leicester House, had aligned himself politically with the parliamentary opposition to his father's ministers, and had succeeded his father as George II in 1727, with an open delight that he barely troubled to conceal. George II had then proceeded to hate his own eldest son in turn, with the same visibility and the same political consequences. The son in question had been Frederick, Prince of Wales, who had held his own opposition court at Leicester House, who had been kept from any role in his father's government, and who had died at 44 in 1751 before he could inherit, leaving the throne to pass over a generation to his 13-year-old son, the future George III. George III had grown up in the household of his widowed mother, the Princess Augusta, watching his grandfather conduct the affairs of the family with the same cold cruelty he had shown to his father. The boy had been raised by a mother who had told him, repeatedly, that his only protection in the world would be his own moral seriousness and his own private domestic happiness. The boy had absorbed the lesson. He had come to the throne in 1760 at 22 with the absolute determination that his own household would be different. He would love his sons. He would be devoted to his wife. He would raise his children himself in the manner of a country gentleman, with rules and routines and rectitude. He would break the Hanoverian pattern. He would not break it. The pattern was structural, and the pattern would do to him what it had done to his grandfather and his great-grandfather, and Charlotte would watch it do so, one son at a time, beginning around 1780, and continuing for the next 30 years. But the king had not yet realized this on the day he married her. He was 23. He was hopeful. He had married a girl whose body was meant to produce the sons who would not this time hate him. He had been told that the calculations about her would begin on the morning after the wedding, and he had not understood, then, that the calculations would never stop. There was a further refinement to the anxiety, which Charlotte would learn from her mother-in-law within weeks of the wedding, and which would shape the whole subsequent geography of her motherhood. The dynasty did not just need a son, the dynasty needed several sons. Royal children died in the 18th century at rates the modern listener does not always remember. Of Queen Anne's 17 pregnancies, none had produced a child who had survived to adulthood. Of the 7 children George II and his wife Caroline of Ansbach had raised to adulthood, several had nonetheless died before their parents. A reigning monarch with one son was a monarch one fever away from a succession crisis. A reigning monarch with 2 sons was a monarch one bad year away from the same. The dynasty needed an heir and a spare and a backup spare, and possibly a fourth. Because the laws of probability in the 18th century royal nursery were unforgiving, and the country could not, after the Stuart catastrophe and the long childlessness of Queen Anne, afford another succession crisis caused by the failure of a queen's body to produce surviving sons. This was the dynasty Charlotte had married. She did not know any of this, or knew only the broadest outlines, on the day of her wedding. She would learn it from Augusta, her mother-in-law, in the first 6 months of the marriage. Augusta would tell her, in private audiences, what it had cost to be the wife of Frederick, Prince of Wales, the hated heir who had not lived to inherit. Augusta would tell her what the cost was to be the daughter-in-law of a king who hated his son. Augusta would tell her, with the slow, heavy clarity of a woman who had watched her own husband die at 44 in the middle of a family quarrel, and had raised her son alone, that the only protection a queen of this dynasty had was the production of enough sons. Augusta would not be cruel about it. Augusta would be, in fact, kind. But Augusta would be clear. The 17-year-old foreign girl, in the months after her wedding, would have it explained to her by her mother-in-law that the calculus of her body was the calculus of the dynasty, and that she should expect to spend the next 15 years of her life producing children, and that the children should be sons, and that the sons should arrive at a rate of approximately one every 18 months, and that the work would not be finished until the dynasty was secure, and that the dynasty was not yet secure, and would not be secure for a long time. Charlotte would receive these audiences in the small drawing room of her own apartments at St. James's, with Augusta on a sofa opposite her and a maid pouring tea. She would understand them slowly. She was not stupid, but she was 17, and her English was still poor, and the substance of what Augusta was telling her was the sort of substance that a young woman absorbs only as it begins to be confirmed by the calendar of her own body. She would understand it most clearly in late November 1761, when she missed her courses for the first time, and the German maids around her registered the absence within 48 hours, and the news was carried to Mistress of the Robes, and from the Mistress of the Robes to the Princess Augusta, and from Augusta to the King. The king was delighted. The court was delighted. The kingdom was, 3 months later, when the news was made public, delighted. Charlotte was 17 years old. She had been queen for 3 months. She was, by the calculus of the dynasty, exactly on schedule. What was expected of her, in the first year after the wedding, and in the long years that followed, was never written down. It did not need to be written down. It was understood by everyone in the household, including by Charlotte herself within weeks of her arrival, and it had the precision of a contract, even though no contract had been signed. The expectation, in its simplest form, was 4 sons by the time the Queen was 25. The expectation, in its slightly more nuanced form, was as many children as the Queen could bear in the years she was bearing them, with a preference for sons, with a tolerance for daughters in between sons, and with the understanding that the bearing would not stop until the dynasty had its security and the Queen had served the purpose for which she had been brought across the sea. The expectation was enforced not by command, but by attention. The Queen's body became, within weeks of her wedding, the subject of a watch that had no formal name and no formal mechanism, but that was, by 1762, more thorough than the watch on any other body in the kingdom. Her monthly cycles were tracked by the German maids who attended her in her dressing room, and who emptied her chamber pot, and who washed her linen. The maids reported to Madame Schwellenberg, who had come over with her from Mecklenburg, and who was the Queen's keeper of the robes, and the Queen's confidant, and the Queen's keeper, increasingly, of all the Queen's secrets, including this one. Madame Schwellenberg reported to the Mistress of the Robes, who was an English noblewoman appointed by the King, and who reported in turn to the Princess Augusta and to the King himself. The chain of information about the Queen's reproductive state was, in the autumn of 1761, 4 people long, and a delayed period was news inside that chain within 48 hours of the missed date. The royal physicians attended her on rotation. They were 3 in number, all elderly, all male, all titled, and each of them came once a week to her apartments to ask her questions about her digestion and her sleep and her appetites and her courses, and to take her pulse, and to examine the colour of her tongue and the whites of her eyes. The questions were asked in the formal third person. How is Her Majesty's appetite this week? How has Her Majesty slept? And Charlotte, who had been raised in a household where the Duchess's body was nobody's business but the Duchess's, answered them in the same formal third person, and learned, slowly, not to be surprised by them. Her diet was supervised. The royal kitchens were given instructions about what was to be served to the Queen and what was not. Red meat was encouraged. Strong wine was discouraged. Hot baths were forbidden after the first confirmed pregnancy. Riding was forbidden as soon as a possible pregnancy was suspected. Walking was encouraged in mild weather. The supervision was not cruel. The supervision was, by the standard of 18th century royal court medicine, thoughtful and protective. But the supervision was thorough. The Queen understood that it was thorough, and she understood that the thoroughness was not for her own sake, but for the sake of the dynasty's confidence in the contents of her uterus. The strangest part of all of it, in her own later private accounts of these years, was not the watch on her body. It was the way that everyone around her, including the king himself, pretended that no such watch existed. The supervisions and the trackings and the dietary orders were issued without anyone in the household acknowledging that they were about the production of an heir. The king, who was the kindest man in her life and who loved her, would never, in the years they lived together, refer in her presence to the dynastic purpose of their marriage. He would speak of their children as their children, as a country gentleman speaks of his family, with a pride and a tenderness that were entirely sincere, and he would never indicate to her that the production of those children had been, to the kingdom and to his ministers and to his mother, and even in some submerged corner of his own mind, the explicit purpose of the marriage. Charlotte understood that the pretence was a kindness. Charlotte also understood, in the privacy of her own head, that the pretence was strange, and that the strangeness was the actual condition of her marriage. She was loved as a wife. She was watched as a vessel. The two things ran on parallel tracks in the same household, and she was expected, by everyone, including her own husband, to behave as though only the first of them was real. She conceived for the first time in late November 1761, 11 weeks after her wedding. She knew, in her own body, by the second mist period in mid-December. The maids knew within a week. Madame Schwellenberg knew. The mistress of the robes was informed before Christmas. The king was told on Christmas Eve, in a brief private audience, that the mistress of the robes requested with him in his closet at St. James's, and the king came directly to Charlotte's apartments afterwards and kissed her on the forehead and said only, in the gentle formal English she was still learning to follow, that he was very glad. The news was not made public until early March, when the Queen had passed the first 3 months and the physicians considered the pregnancy stable. Once the news was public, the kingdom relaxed. The newspapers congratulated the king. The ministers congratulated each other. Augusta congratulated her daughter-in-law in a long letter of formal tenderness that Charlotte kept for the rest of her life. The expectation had been met. The expectation, of course, would not stop being met. The expectation would now begin to apply to the spare. The child was born on the 17th of August, 1762, at 24 minutes past 7 in the morning, in the Queen's apartments at St. James's. He was a healthy boy. He weighed 9 pounds. He was named George Augustus Frederick, and he was, by the Act of Settlement of 1701, the next King of Great Britain after his father. The cannon at the Tower of London were fired in salute. The bells of every parish church in London rang for the better part of the morning. The newspapers issued special editions. The kingdom celebrated for 3 days. Letters of congratulation arrived from every Protestant court in Europe and from several Catholic ones. The king visited the Queen's apartments within the hour. He brought her a small box containing a string of pearls which had been his grandmother's, and he kissed her hands, and he wept, in a manner that was not entirely steady, with the relief of a man who has been waiting since the day of his wedding for the moment that has now come. The Prince of Wales, as he was known from the day of his birth, was not raised by his mother in any sense that a modern listener would recognise. He was given his own household within weeks of his birth. He was assigned a wet nurse, who lived in the nursery at St. James's, and who fed him every 3 hours, and who slept in a cot beside his cradle. He was assigned a sub-governess, who managed the daily routine of his rooms. He was assigned eventually a governess, who would supervise his education from the age of 3. He had his own pages and his own footman and his own physician. The household he was given, in the autumn of his birth, was larger than the household his mother had grown up in at Miro, and the household his mother had grown up in at Miro had been the seat of a ruling duke. The Prince of Wales, at 6 months old, presided over more servants than his uncle, the Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, did. Charlotte visited him daily. She would come to the nursery in the late mornings, after her own toilet had been completed, and she would sit in a chair by the window, and the wet nurse would bring him to her and place him in her arms, and Charlotte would hold him for perhaps half an hour, and she would feed him from a small spoon if he would take it, and she would speak to him in the German she had not yet been able to give up speaking, and she would hand him back to the nurse, and she would leave. She would visit in the afternoons sometimes, and in the evenings before her own supper, but the visiting was visiting. The visiting was not the kind of constant maternal presence that Charlotte's own mother had given her in the small household at Miro. The Prince of Wales was the kingdom's child. The Prince of Wales had a kingdom's establishment. The Prince of Wales was visited by his mother, who loved him, but who lived 3 corridors and 4 rooms away, and who came in for an hour a day, and who was, by the standard of an 18th century royal nursery, exemplary in her attendance, and who would never, in the years to come, understand that the daily hour had not been enough. She would understand, in middle age, that she had not been her son's mother in the way her mother had been hers. She would not know what to do with the understanding. She would be told by her own mother and her mother-in-law and her ladies and everyone in the household that she was doing it correctly. She would believe them. The Prince of Wales in adulthood would remember the visits with a fondness that was almost ceremonial, and would say of his mother, in private letters, that she had loved him in the way that queens loved princes, which was at a distance, with kindness, on a schedule. He would not, in adulthood, blame her for this. He would simply, not in adulthood, feel that he had been loved in the way he had needed to be loved. He would seek the loving elsewhere for the rest of his life, with mixed and ultimately unhappy results. Charlotte conceived again in late November 1762, 3 months after the birth of the Prince of Wales. The maids knew by the new year. The mistress of the robes was informed in January. The king was told. The ministers were told. The kingdom was told in March. The expectation, on its second pass, was being met on the same schedule as the first. The queen was 19. She had been queen for 15 months. She had a son who was 6 months old, and she was carrying another. The watch on her body had not lifted in the year between the 2 pregnancies. The watch had, if anything, intensified, because the production of one son had confirmed that she could produce sons, and the dynasty had calibrated its expectations accordingly. The spare was coming on the schedule the dynasty had set. The second child was born on the 16th of August, 1763, at 37 minutes past 4 in the morning in the Queen's apartments at St. James's. He was a healthy boy. He weighed 8 pounds. He was named Frederick, after the Queen's late father-in-law, the Prince of Wales, who had died before he could inherit, and after the great Prussian king, who was the king's cousin and ally. He was, by the order of succession established at his birth, second in line to the throne. He was 364 days younger than his brother. The cannon at the tower fired again. The bells rang again. The newspapers issued their special editions again. The dynasty had its spare. Charlotte was 19. She had been queen for 23 months. She had borne 2 sons. She had achieved in less than 2 years what queens had sometimes taken a decade to achieve, and what Queen Anne, despite 17 pregnancies, had failed to achieve at all. The kingdom was, for the second time in 12 months, jubilant. The king was, for the second time in 12 months, weeping in private with relief. Augusta wrote her daughter-in-law a letter of warm, formal congratulation. The ministers congratulated each other and themselves. The watch on Charlotte's body relaxed, for the first time, into something less than total. She was given, in the weeks after Frederick's birth, what might have been called a small breathing room. The dynasty had its insurance. The Queen had served her primary purpose. There was no immediate need for the third son to arrive within the next 18 months. The Queen would be permitted for perhaps a year to recover. Frederick was given his own household, in the manner of his brother. He was assigned a wet nurse, a sub-governess, a future governess, pages, footman, a physician. He was placed in a separate nursery from his brother, at first within the same building at St. James's, and later, when the family moved to Kew, in a separate small house on the grounds. The two boys in their first years did not live together. They were brought together to play, in the mornings, under the supervision of the senior nursery staff, but the rest of their days were lived in parallel households a corridor apart. They knew each other. They were, in their first years, fond of each other. They did not, in the way that brothers in a smaller household might have done, share a bed, or share toys spontaneously, or hear one another cry in the night. They were each, separately, the centre of a small establishment whose business it was to produce a healthy royal child, and the establishments were administered separately, because that was how the dynasty had decided that royal princes were raised. Charlotte visited both of them daily. She would come to George's nursery in the late mornings, and to Frederick's in the early afternoons, and she would hold each of them in turn, and she would speak to them in German, and she would hand them back to their nurses, and she would leave. She was, by the spring of 1764, the mother of 2 princes of England, and the wife of a king who loved her, and the queen of a kingdom that had been waiting for her sons, and she was 20 years old. She had been in England for 2.5 years. She had left her mother in Mecklenburg-Strelitz before the wedding, and would never have that old household back again. She would not see her mother again. Her mother had died in 1761, and Charlotte would receive the news at Kew, and she would write a letter of mourning that has not survived, and she would continue with the daily visiting of her sons in their nurseries, because the daily visiting was the work she had been brought across the sea to do, and the work had not finished, and the work, she was beginning to understand, would not finish for a long time. She would conceive again in the autumn of 1764. The third son was already on his way. The third son was William, born on the 21st of August 1765 in the Queen's apartments at St. James's. He was named for the Stuart King William III and for William the Conqueror, and for whichever further William the King and Queen had wished to honour, and the kingdom received him with a smaller but still substantial fanfare. The cannon fired. The bells rang. The newspapers congratulated the dynasty on its growing security, 3 sons before the Queen's 22nd birthday. The dynasty had passed the threshold at which a single bad fever could no longer end the line. The kingdom relaxed further. The watch on Charlotte's body, for the first time since her wedding, became something close to ordinary medical attention rather than dynastic surveillance. Charlotte was 21. She had borne 3 sons in just over 3 years. Her body, by the report of the physicians, had recovered well from each of the pregnancies. Her mood, by the report of those around her, was calm. She had begun, in the year between the 2nd and the 3rd pregnancies, to take a more active interest in the management of her own household and in the gardens of the smaller country houses, the king had begun to acquire for the family's private use. She had begun to learn English in earnest, having previously relied on a German vocabulary supplemented by French. She had begun, in the private hours of her evenings, to develop the habits of reading and music and embroidery that would shape the rest of her domestic life. She was a queen who had served. She would continue to serve. But the immediate emergency of producing the heir and the spare had passed, and she had been permitted to exhale. The exhalation did not last. She conceived again within a year of William's birth, and bore a daughter, Charlotte the Princess Royal, on the 29th of September, 1766. She conceived again within a year of that daughter, and bore Edward on the 2nd of November, 1767. She conceived again, and bore Augusta on the 8th of November, 1768. She conceived again, and bore Elizabeth on the 22nd of May, 1770. By the time she was 26, she had borne 7 children in 8 years. She would bear 8 more in the next 13. The household at this point had moved decisively to Kew, the modest brick palace on the south bank of the Thames that the king had purchased from his mother and that he had begun to remake as the family seat. St James's remained the official London residence, where the Queen held her drawing rooms and where state business was conducted. Buckingham House, which the king had bought for the Queen in 1762 and which would later become Buckingham Palace, was used for the Queen's London residence and for the raising of the youngest children. Kew was the private heart of the family. The king's intent was that Kew would be the country place where the children would be raised in something approaching the manner of a country gentleman's family, in a household informal enough that the children would learn ordinary domestic habits and would not become the kind of court-spoiled princes their Hanoverian uncles had become. The king wrote out, in his own hand, a set of regulations for the nursery at Kew. The regulations specified the hour at which each child was to rise, the hour at which each was to dine, the menu of each meal, the hours of study, the hours of exercise, the form of religious observance, the prayers to be said before bed, the temperature at which the nursery rooms were to be kept, the kind of clothing the children were to wear, the books they were to read, and the corporal punishments that were and were not permitted, rod applied by the governor or by the king himself for major infractions, verbal reprimand for minor ones, never the slap or the cuff. The regulations ran to 43 numbered paragraphs. They were issued to the governor of the nursery, the Reverend Frederick Markham, in the spring of 1765, when the heir was not yet 3. They were observed with some variation for the next 20 years. Charlotte read the regulations when the king showed them to her. She did not, in the conversations that have been recorded, object to any of them. She was, by inclination and by upbringing, a woman who believed in modest habits and in the value of self-discipline, and the king's regulations were the codification of habits she would have applied to her children anyway. She had been raised in a household at Miro, in which the Duchess and her children had eaten plain food and worn plain clothes and observed regular hours, and the king's Kew was a more elaborate version of the same principle. The Queen, in this period, was in agreement with the king about the raising of the children. They were, in the late 1760s and the early 1770s, a household united. The household was also, in the daily texture of it, intensely domestic in a way the British royal family had not been for several generations. The king dined at home with the Queen 4 nights of every 5. He spent his evenings reading aloud or playing chess with her, or examining the schedule of agricultural works at the Kew farms. He visited the children's nurseries himself, daily, in a manner that none of his predecessors had done. He carried his small sons on his shoulders. He taught them the names of trees in the gardens. He helped them learn their letters. He was, by every contemporary account, an attentive and present father in a way that astonished the older members of the court, who could remember the cold formal distance of the previous reign, and who had not expected anything else of this one. The young royal family in the late 1760s and early 1770s was, briefly, what the king had set out to make it, a model household, with a devoted wife and a hands-on father and a brood of healthy children raised in modest country habits. The visitors who came to Kew in those years went away charmed. The painters who came to record the family at home painted scenes of intimate domesticity that became famous and that were reproduced in engravings and sold in shops, and the engravings circulated in Britain and on the continent as evidence that the new dynasty was, in its private life, the kind of family the country could approve of. The fifth son, Ernest Augustus, was born on the 5th of June 1771 in the Queen's apartments at Buckingham House. He was named for the Queen's brother, who was Charlotte's favourite of her own siblings and who would inherit the Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in time. Ernest was a difficult birth. The labour had been long, and the child had been positioned awkwardly, and the physicians had been concerned for the Queen's life for several hours. She had recovered. The child was healthy. He was assigned to the nursery establishment at Kew, where his 3 elder brothers were already living, and the household of small princes grew to 4. The Queen, at 27, had borne 7 children. She was beginning to look tired in a way she had not previously looked tired in the portraits painted of her at this period. The 6th son, Augustus, was born on the 27th of January, 1773. The 7th son, Adolphus, was born on the 24th of February, 1774. 2 more daughters, Mary and Sophia, were born in 1776 and 1777. The household at Kew by the late 1770s was crowded with children, sons and daughters, filling the nurseries and schoolrooms, and the Queen had been pregnant or nursing more or less continuously for 16 years. She would bear 5 more children before she was finished. She had, by 1774, given the kingdom the 4 sons the unspoken target had required. She had given them more than the target required. The dynasty was secure to a degree it had not been secure in 3 generations. The watch on the Queen's body lifted into something close to normal medical attention. The work of producing the next generation was, by the calculus of the dynasty, complete. The work of raising the next generation, which was the work the Queen had been doing in parallel for 15 years, was the work that would now take over the rest of her life. The Kew nursery in the late 1770s was, by the testimony of the household staff and by the documents the king himself kept, the happiest period of the family's life together. 6 sons, 4 daughters, 2 devoted parents, a household of attentive staff, a modest brick palace surrounded by gardens, the long English summer afternoons when the boys played in the meadows and the girls walked with their mother along the gravel paths between the box hedges. The king's regulations were, in those years, the regulations of a family that was largely meeting them. The boys rose at 6. They studied Latin and Greek and mathematics for 3 hours in the morning with the Reverend Markham and the under-tutors. They dined at 1 o'clock on plain food. They were given 2 hours of physical exercise in the afternoon, riding in good weather, fencing in poor. They studied modern languages and music in the late afternoon. They supped at 6. They prayed before bed at 8. The girls had a parallel schedule with modifications for needlework and household instruction. The Queen visited each child's rooms daily. The King visited each child's rooms several times a day. The family ate together on Sundays. The family attended chapel together on Sundays. The household in 1778 and 1779 was the household the king had set out to build 17 years earlier and was being widely held up across Europe as a model of royal domesticity. But what the household was not, and what the king had not been able to see in the autumn of his greatest pride in it, was a household that had figured out how to raise the particular children it was raising. The boys by 1779 were no longer the small children to whom the king's regulations had been written. They were becoming, one by one. The heir was 17, the spare was 16, William was 14, Edward was 12, Ernest was 8, Augustus was 6, Adolphus was 5. The regulations that had worked tolerably well when applied to a 6-year-old and a 5-year-old in identical schoolrooms were beginning, with the older boys, to produce results the king had not anticipated and would not, for several more years, be willing to acknowledge. The first place the trouble showed was the schoolroom. The heir and the spare had been put together in the same schoolroom from the age of 3, on the king's principle that brothers close in age should be raised as companions and not as rivals. The schoolroom was supervised by the Reverend Markham, who would later become Archbishop of York, and who was a stern Latinist of the old school, with little patience for slowness and a free hand with the rod. The Reverend Markham was instructed by the king that he was to treat the princes as ordinary boys, and was to apply ordinary discipline, and was not to flatter them or spare them or excuse them on account of their rank. The Reverend Markham took the instructions seriously. He applied the rod when he believed the rod was warranted. He warranted it often. And the trouble was that the heir and the spare were not equally suited to the curriculum the Reverend Markham was teaching. Frederick, the spare, was the quicker child. He memorized Latin declensions easily. He read aloud with a confident voice. He answered questions in the schoolroom without hesitating. He was, in the Reverend Markham's reports to the king, a credit to the household and a delight to teach. George, the heir, was the slower child. He was not unintelligent. He had in fact a quick verbal intelligence and a real gift for languages, once he had been allowed to learn them on his own terms. But he was the kind of child who needed encouragement before he could perform, and who shut down when he was corrected publicly, and who would, when shamed in front of his younger brother, refuse to speak for the rest of the lesson. The Reverend Markham did not understand this child. The Reverend Markham did not believe in encouragement. The Reverend Markham believed in correction. The Reverend Markham applied the rod to the heir of England, who was the larger of the two boys, more often than to the spare, who was the smaller, and the heir of England, by the age of 10, had begun to associate the schoolroom with shame and humiliation, and to associate his younger brother with the easy successes that his own performance had failed to achieve. Charlotte saw this. She saw it earlier than the king did, because she visited the schoolroom less frequently than her husband, and was therefore not present for the daily performances, but only for the after-effects, which she could read in her elder son's face at the daily visits to his rooms. She would sit in the chair by the window. She would call the Prince of Wales over to her. She would put her hand on his head. She would ask him what he had read that morning. He would tell her. She would ask him a question about it that she knew he could answer. He would answer it correctly. She would praise him. She would see in the lifting of his face what a praise from her did to him, and she would see in the same lifting that he was not receiving such praise from anyone else. She wrote to her brother in Mecklenburg in the autumn of 1779, when the Prince of Wales was 17, and the household at Kew was in its golden moment, and she said something to him in German that has survived in the correspondence, and that is among the most precise things she ever said about her eldest son. She said, "He is good-tempered and intelligent, but he requires the love of those around him in a way I cannot always give." She was 35 years old when she wrote this. She was the mother of a crowded royal nursery. She was the wife of a king who was beloved at court for his attentiveness to his family. She was telling her brother, in a sentence she would not have been permitted to write to anyone in England, that she understood her eldest son to be a boy whose particular need was for a particular kind of love, and that she was not giving it to him, and that no one else in the household was either. She did not write the next sentence, which would have been the sentence in which she said, "Why?" The reason was the regulations, and the schedule, and the schoolroom, and the household, and the dynasty, and the unspoken understanding that an heir to the throne of England was not, in any case, the kind of child to whom the love of an ordinary mother could be given in the ordinary way. The reason was the whole structure of the household she had married into. She did not need to write the next sentence. Her brother would have understood the pattern that was beginning to show in the schoolroom in the late 1770s would, in the next decade, become the pattern that defined the heir's adult life. He had been the larger child, and the slower child, and the child who needed more, and he had not been given more. And at 17 he was beginning to look outside the household for the more he had not received. By the time he was 21, the looking outside would become the public scandal of his debts, and his mistresses, and his secret marriage, and his political alliance with his father's enemies. By the time he was 25, the looking outside would have hardened into the lifelong pattern of an heir who could not bear his father, and could not be reached by his mother, and who had spent his whole adolescence preparing for the role of heir in opposition that the Hanoverian pattern had always produced. The pattern had not been broken by his father. The pattern had been, if anything, accelerated, because the king had been so determined to break it that he had imposed regulations on his sons that no 18th century pattern of regulations had been able to absorb. The spare was a different problem, and not, in those years, recognised as a problem at all. Frederick was the quick child, the favourite of the Reverend Markham, the favourite increasingly of the king, the boy who answered correctly and laughed easily and was praised. He was being raised in the schoolroom of the late 1770s as the child who could do no wrong. He could not, in those years, do wrong. He would learn in his 20s and 30s that the quick child of a household tends to grow up confident in his judgment to a degree that the slower child does not, and the confidence in his judgment would lead him into the Mary Ann Clark scandal of 1809 and into the army promotions trafficking case that would end his command and humiliate his family. He would also, in the same adult years, prove the most loyal of his brothers to the family and the kindest to his mother. He would be the son Charlotte could talk to. He would be the son who came to Windsor when the others did not. The competition between him and his elder brother, planted in the schoolroom at Kew in the 1770s, would last for 50 years, and Charlotte would spend the second half of her life trying to broker between them and would never entirely succeed. The other boys, in those years, were not yet the people they would become. William was at the age of restless boyhood, the third son, with no obvious role in the household, watching his two elder brothers fight over the schoolroom and deciding, without anyone helping him decide, that he wanted to go to sea. He would write to his father in 1778, at 13, asking to be sent into the navy. The king would consider the request and would agree to it. William would leave the household in 1779, at 13 years old, as a midshipman on the Prince George, a ship of the line on the home station. He would not return to Kew for 2 years. The household, in the late 1770s, had begun the process of dispersing the spares to their professions. William would be the first to go. The others would follow over the next 15 years. Edward, at 12 in 1779, was the next on the line. He was a difficult boy. He was rigid where his elder brothers had been pliable. He was in the schoolroom a more dogged student than Frederick, and a more determined student than George, but he was also a child given to obsessions and to a kind of military precision that struck observers in those years as unusual in a boy his age. He would later be sent to Geneva at 16 for further military education, and to Gibraltar at 20 as a brigadier general, and the rigidity that had been visible in him at 12 would become, in middle age, the famous severity of the Duke of Kent, whose regiments were the most disciplined and the most resentful in the army, and whose troops would attempt to mutiny against him in 1802 in Gibraltar, after he imposed punishments his officers considered excessive. The seeds of the man were visible in the child. Charlotte saw them. She did not know what to do with them. Ernest, at 8 in 1779, was a different child again. He was small for his age, and quick, and clever in a way the older boys had not been clever, with a gift for languages and a streak of cruelty in the small interactions of the nursery that the household staff had begun to remark on among themselves. The under-nurse at Kew wrote to her mother in 1778 that Prince Ernest was the kind of child who pulled the wings off butterflies, and who was not corrected by any of the senior staff because Prince Ernest was clever enough to do the pulling out of sight. He would grow up to be a man of whom similar things would continue to be said, and not always quietly, and Charlotte would spend the next 40 years of her life trying to defend a son she did not entirely trust and could not entirely love, and Ernest in turn would prove, in middle age, to be the most fiercely loyal to her of all her children, in a manner that was painful to her in a particular way. He was 8 in 1779. The complicated story was already in him. None of it would resolve in his lifetime. Augustus, at 6, was a quiet asthmatic boy with a love of reading and a chronic chest that the physicians worried about. Adolphus, at 5, was the cheerful, uncomplicated youngest son who attached himself to whichever older brother was present, and who was, in the household, the easiest of all the boys to love. The 4 daughters, in those years, were a separate part of the household, raised in their own nursery, with their own governess, on the Queen's side rather than the King's, and this story will not linger on them beyond what their brother's treatment of them later reveals. But in 1779, the Queen had 4 daughters under 13, and the daughters were a daily part of her happiness. The household, in the autumn of 1779, contained 10 living children, none of them yet old enough to leave home except William, who was already at sea. The household contained, in other words, the years immediately before the deluge. The pattern had been set. The children had begun to become the people they would be. The king, in his pride in the model family he had built, had not yet seen any of it. Charlotte, in her own understanding, had seen most of it. She had not yet seen the worst of what was coming, because the worst was 3 years away, and would arrive in the form of a death that would alter the household forever. Octavius was born on the 23rd of February, 1779, the 13th child and 8th son. He was a delicate baby who took his time finding his strength, but who was, by his first birthday, a thriving infant with the dark eyes of his mother and a sunny temperament that delighted the king. The king, by 1781, was openly in love with this child in a way he had not been in love with any of his other sons. Octavius would be brought to his father's apartments in the late afternoons, and the king would sit with the boy in his lap for an hour at a time, doing nothing in particular, simply holding him, and the household staff would remark on it among themselves, because the king had not held any of his elder sons in this manner since they were infants. Octavius was, in the household, the king's joy. The household understood this without needing it to be said. Charlotte was glad of it. She had watched her husband become, in the years since Ernest, a little more remote from the older boys, a little less interested in their daily affairs, more occupied with the business of state and the long crisis of the American War that had begun in 1775, and that was, by 1781, going badly. Octavius was the late child who had restored to the king some of the simple paternal pleasure of the earlier years. Charlotte was grateful. Alfred was born on the 22nd of September 1780, the 14th child and 9th son. He was a sickly baby almost from birth. The physicians did not name a specific complaint in the way that 18th century physicians often did not name specific complaints, but they communicated to the Queen, in the careful periphrastic manner of court medicine, that the child's constitution was not strong, and that close attention would be required. Charlotte gave him close attention. She visited the nursery several times a day. She held him herself for longer periods than she had held the older children. She permitted the wet nurse fewer hours alone with him than was usual in the royal nursery. She was 36. She had borne 14 children. She knew, in the way that women who have borne many children come to know, that this child might not live, and she gave him the attention that a mother gives a child who might not live, because she could not bear to think that he might die without having been held enough by her. He lived for nearly 23 months. He died on the 20th of August, 1782, at Kew, of what the physicians eventually called a slow inflammation of the chest, which is the 18th century language for what may have been any of several wasting illnesses of infancy. He was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 27th of August, in a coffin in the royal vault. The king attended. The Queen did not. The royal physicians had been clear that her own health, in the weeks after the loss, was not sufficient for the journey to London. She remained at Kew. She received the household's condolences in the drawing-room of her apartments. She did not weep in front of her staff. She wept, by the later testimony of Madame Schwellenberg, only in the privacy of her own bedroom, late at night, and only when she was certain that no one in the household was within hearing. The king's grief was different. The king wept openly in the household. He talked of Alfred constantly, in the weeks after the death, to the surprise of the courtiers and the ministers, who had not expected a king to grieve a son who had not lived to be 2 years old with the intensity the king showed. He commissioned a portrait of Alfred from memory, from the painter Thomas Gainsborough, who delivered it within 6 weeks. The portrait hung in the king's closet for the rest of his life. The king, in the autumn of 1782, was a man of 44 who had buried a son, and who was permitting himself to feel the loss in a manner that did not entirely fit the kingly self he had spent 20 years constructing. The Queen watched her husband and was, in her private accounts, frightened by what she was seeing. The king had always been the steadier of them. The king had always been the one who managed his emotions in public. The king, in the weeks after Alfred's death, was not managing his emotions in public, and the Queen began to understand that she would now need to do the managing for both of them. Octavius was 4 years old. He was a strong, healthy, bright child, the favourite of the king, the sunny boy who had been brought up to his father's apartments in the late afternoons for the previous 3 years. He fell ill in late April of 1783, 8 months after his younger brother's death, with what the physicians initially thought was a cold, and what within a week had become a high fever, and what within 10 days was identified, by the symptoms the physicians named in their reports, as smallpox, which had been spreading through the household servants at Kew that spring, and which had reached the prince's nursery despite the inoculation he had been given the previous year. The inoculation had failed. The fever rose. The prince was placed in a darkened room, attended by 3 physicians around the clock. The king came to his bedside every hour. The Queen stayed in the room for the better part of 3 days, holding the child's hand, sponging his forehead with vinegar and water, watching him slip in and out of consciousness. He died on the 3rd of May, 1783, at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning. He was 4 years and 10 weeks old. The king was inconsolable. The king wept in public for 3 days. The king refused to attend cabinet meetings for a week. The king walked alone in the gardens at Kew for hours at a time, talking to himself in a manner the gardeners noticed and reported, in nervous undertones, to the senior staff. The king commissioned, from Gainsborough again, a portrait of Octavius painted from a death mask, and the portrait was added to the one of Alfred in his closet, and the king would, for the rest of his life, refer to the 2 boys as having gone before him and as waiting for him. He told the household, in the weeks after Octavius's death, that he did not believe there could be a heaven if Octavius was not in it. He told his ministers that the loss of Octavius had been the worst blow of his reign. He had reigned, by 1783, for 23 years. He had presided over the loss of the American colonies, which the Treaty of Paris had just confirmed. He had lost the worst war his country had fought in 100 years. He considered the death of his 4-year-old son to be the worst blow of his reign. Charlotte, in this period, was the family's quiet anchor. She had grieved Alfred in private. She grieved Octavius in private. She did not permit herself the public grief her husband was permitting himself, partly because she was a queen, and a queen could not be seen in public to be undone by personal loss, and partly because someone in the household needed to continue to function, and that someone was clearly going to have to be her. She managed the household. She supervised the children. She attended to the king. She wrote, in the weeks after Octavius's death, the letters of formal acknowledgement to the European courts that had sent condolences. She kept the daily routines going. She visited each of the surviving children's rooms on the same schedule she had always visited them. She did not, in any document that survives, speak to anyone in the household of her own grief beyond the general acknowledgement that she had lost a child. She kept a locket. The locket contained a twist of Octavius's hair, cut by Madame Schwellenberg in the hour after his death, and tied with a silk ribbon, and the locket was placed on a chain that Charlotte wore around her neck under her dress, where no one in the household could see it, and where it would remain for the next 35 years until her own death. The locket has not survived in the public record. The household account of it is the only evidence we have. The locket was the only public sign she ever permitted herself to give of how she had carried the loss, and the locket was hidden under her clothing, where the public sign was no sign at all. The 2 boys were buried together, eventually, in the royal vault at Westminster. The king visited their tombs annually for the rest of the years he was sane. The queen did not accompany him. She would, in the later years of her life, occasionally refer to the boys in private letters to her brother and to her elder daughter, in the gentle, factual manner she used to refer to other beloved dead, but she did not speak of them publicly, and she did not permit the household to speak of them in her hearing. The grief was private. The grief was also, by the standards of the 18th century court, suppressed to a degree that was visible to those who looked closely. The queen had been changed by the loss. The household had been changed by the loss. The king's mind, by the assessment of the physicians who attended him in his later illnesses, had been changed by the loss in a more lasting way than the king himself, in 1783, had been able to recognise. The first faint disturbances of the king's mind, the irritabilities and the verbal eccentricities that the household had begun to notice in him by 1786, and that would become the first major breakdown in 1788, were dated by the physicians who attended him in 1789 to the period after Octavius's death. The king, they wrote, had never entirely returned to the temperament he had before the autumn of 1783. The queen they did not write but might have had not entirely returned to the temperament she had before that autumn either. The household by 1784 was a different household from the one it had been in 1782. The children were the same children. The parents were not the same parents. The dynasty was, in its private interior, beginning to come apart in ways that would not be visible for several more years, but that had begun. 11 years earlier, in 1772, when the heir was 9 and the spare was 8, and the household at Kew was still in the golden years before the deaths, the king had passed a law that would do more damage to the future of his sons' marriages than any private grief or any private illness was capable of doing. He had passed it in a private fury, and he had passed it without consulting the Queen, and he had passed it without anticipating, at the age of 34, that he would live another 48 years, and that he would, in the course of those years, watch the law produce the consequences he had not foreseen. The law was called the Royal Marriages Act. It was the trap the king laid for his own family. He laid it in his own hand. He had not meant to lay it for his sons. He had meant to lay it for his brothers. But the trap, once set, did not distinguish between brothers and sons, and the king's sons would walk into it one by one across the next 30 years, and the queen would watch them walk into it, and the queen would understand, by the end of her life, that the worst piece of damage her husband had ever done to their children had been done in the second decade of his reign, when their children were too young to be married, and the law had seemed to him to be only about his brothers. The story began in the early 1770s. The king had 2 younger brothers, William Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and Henry Frederick, Duke of Cumberland. Both were unmarried in their early 30s. Both were considered, by the king's ministers and by the king himself, to be a problem in the matter of marriage. They were close to the throne. They were free to marry as private men might marry, because the existing law did not require royal princes to obtain the monarch's consent for their marriages. They had been making, in the late 1760s, a series of attachments to women of whom the king did not approve and of whom the kingdom did not approve, and the king had been growing, year by year, more anxious that one of his brothers would make a marriage that would embarrass the dynasty. The marriage that broke the king's patience was made by the Duke of Cumberland. In November 1771, the Duke married, secretly, a young Englishwoman named Anne Horton, who was the widow of a country gentleman and the daughter of an Irish peer named Lord Ernham. She was 28. She was, by the standards the king applied, entirely unsuitable. She was English-born and not of royal blood. She was, in the king's view, a fortune hunter who had attached herself to a royal duke for the sake of his rank. She was Protestant, which was the minimum the king required of a royal duchess, but she was also, by the king's information, of dubious character, the rumour of which the king had been hearing for some months. The Duke wrote to the king from his country house in late November 1771 to inform him of the marriage. The king received the letter at Kew, in the closet where he conducted his private business, and he had, by the later testimony of the gentleman who attended him that morning, gone white in the face. He had not eaten for the rest of the day. He had not spoken to the Queen at supper. He had retired to his closet and had written, by candlelight, a letter to his Prime Minister, Lord North, instructing him to prepare a bill for Parliament that would prevent any future royal marriage from being made without the express consent of the sovereign. The bill that Lord North prepared, in the spring of 1772, was called the Royal Marriages Act. It provided that no descendant of King George II, other than the issue of princesses who had married into foreign houses, could legally marry without the express consent of the reigning sovereign. Any marriage made without such consent was declared void. The act applied to all royal descendants of any age, with a provision allowing royal descendants over the age of 25 to give a year's notice to the Privy Council and then proceed without the sovereign's consent. Although this provision was effectively a dead letter because no royal descendant in the 18th century would seriously attempt to use it. The Act passed the House of Commons in February 1772 by a substantial majority. It passed the House of Lords in March, despite considerable opposition from a number of senior peers. It received the royal assent on the 1st of April 1772. From that date forward, no member of the royal family of any age could marry without the king's consent, on pain of the marriage being void in law. The Act applied to the king's sons. The king did not, in 1772, focus on this fact. The king's sons, in 1772, were aged 9, 8, 6, 4, and the newly born Ernest at 5 months. The Act applied to them in principle, but not in any sense the king was capable of registering in 1772 in practice. The Act had been passed to prevent the kind of marriages the king's brothers had been making. The king's sons would, in the king's mind in 1772, marry the kind of women the king would choose for them, and the consent provision of the Act would be a formality. What the king did not see in 1772, and what Charlotte did not see in 1772 either, because she had approved of the Act when her husband had explained it to her, was that the Act would do two things in the next 40 years that neither of them had foreseen. It would prevent the king's sons from marrying the women they actually loved, because the king would consent only to marriages with German Protestant princesses of small means and no opinions, and the king's sons, when they became adults, would not love such women. And it would, by preventing the legitimate marriages the king's sons wanted, drive those sons into long, permanent, illegitimate unions with women they could not marry, and into the production of dozens of illegitimate children, none of whom could inherit anything in the line of succession, and into the eventual crisis of 1817, in which the king's only legitimate grandchild would die, and there would be no legitimate heir of his blood, and his middle-aged sons would have to scramble to take German wives at the Queen's funeral pace to produce the next generation. The Act, in other words, was the law that produced the bachelor crisis of 1817. The king passed it in 1772 to punish his brother. He punished, instead, his own sons and his own dynasty. The Queen would understand this slowly, across the next 4 decades, and she would understand it most fully in the autumn of 1817, when her only legitimate grandchild died in childbirth and the dynasty hung, for a year, on the willingness of her sons in their 50s to take German princesses they had never met. The law her husband had passed in the 2nd decade of their marriage was in the 7th decade of their marriage the law that had nearly ended their line. She did not say this to him. She could not say it to him by 1817, because he had been gone from his own mind for 7 years, and was beyond conversation. She had not said it to him in the years he had still been himself, because she had approved of the Act in 1772, and could not retroactively oppose it, and because the king was the kind of man who did not, in any case, revisit his own legislation. The Act stood. The Act would stand until 2013, when the British Parliament finally revised it. The Act was the King's gift to his sons, made in a fury in the spring of 1772, when the sons were small children playing in the gardens at Kew. The sons would receive the gift in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s, and they would understand what their father had done to them, and they would not, any of them, forgive him for it. The first of them to understand it would be the heir in the late 1780s, when he was 25 and was secretly married to Maria Fitzherbert in defiance of an act he had been a child during the passage of. The understanding would, in the end, reach all 9 sons. The last of them to understand it would be Adolphus, the youngest, who would be permitted by the king to marry only in middle age. The act was the long shadow of the king's anger at his brother, and the shadow fell across 40 years of his sons' lives, and Charlotte spent the second half of her motherhood watching the shadow move. The heir became a man by the formal measure on the 12th of August, 1783, when he turned 21. He had become a man by the actual measure 3 years earlier, when his father had given him his own establishment at Buckingham House at the age of 18, and had assumed that the establishment would constitute, by itself, the curriculum of his last formal preparation for the throne. The establishment had been generously funded. The establishment had been given its own staff. The establishment had been given its own carriages and its own table and its own household budget. The establishment had been given everything except the one thing that an 18-year-old heir to a throne in 1780 required, which was guidance from a father who had been able to see, before granting the establishment, that the boy was not yet ready for it. The Prince of Wales, at 18, was the boy his mother had described in her letter to her brother, good-tempered and intelligent and starved for the love of those around him. He was also, by 1780, a young man of considerable personal charm who had inherited from his Hanoverian uncles a fluency of social manner that the king had not inherited and that the king did not entirely trust. He spoke French elegantly, he danced well, he had a good ear for music and a passable singing voice. He was the kind of young man who, when he came into a room of strangers, was within 10 minutes the centre of the room, not because he had pushed himself there, but because the room itself had moved toward him. He was also, by 18, a young man with appetites that the household of Kew had not prepared him to govern, and an annual allowance that did not approach the cost of governing them, and an instinctive understanding that the credit of an heir to the throne would be extended by every merchant in London who could be persuaded to extend it. His debts at 20 were £20,000. His debts at 21 were 40,000. His debts at 23 were 60,000. They would, by his middle 30s, exceed £500,000, an amount that the modern listener can convert by multiplying roughly 100-fold to arrive at a modern figure. The debts were incurred on the things 18th century young men of fortune incurred debts on, which were horses, women, clothes, gambling, art, and houses. He bought paintings. He bought furniture in the French style his father considered vulgar. He bought a house in the country at Brighton, which he would, over the next 30 years, expand and remake into the royal pavilion that survives today as the most architecturally exuberant private building any Hanoverian prince ever commissioned. He bought, at Carlton House in London, an interior of such concentrated decorative magnificence that visiting ambassadors would, in their reports home to their courts, describe it as the most luxurious private dwelling in Europe. And he pursued women in the manner of a young man who had been raised to believe that the love of women was a thing he could not have at home, and would therefore have to acquire elsewhere. His first attachment, at 17, had been to the actress Mary Robinson, known as Perdita, after a role she had played in Shakespeare's A Winter's Tale at Drury Lane that the prince had seen and been undone by. He had written her letters of impassioned schoolboy adoration. He had bought her gifts. He had promised her, in writing, a settlement of £20,000, if she would leave the stage and live as his mistress. She had left the stage. She had moved into a house in Mayfair he had taken for her. He had lost interest within 2 years. He had refused to pay the 20,000. The court had been forced to intervene. The king had paid £5,000 to settle her claim, on the strict condition that the letters the prince had written her were returned. The letters were returned. The king burnt them in his closet in the fireplace with his own hand. The king did not speak of the incident again. The queen was not informed of the details. The Queen knew the broader shape of what had happened in the way that mothers know. The next attachment was Maria Fitzherbert. She was a young widow of 28, twice married, twice widowed, Catholic, devout, of modest means, beautiful, and entirely unwilling to be the mistress of a royal prince. The prince met her at a private party in London in early 1784. He was 21. He fell in love with her. He pursued her for over a year. He attempted, in the manner of impassioned young men of the period, what was called a self-inflicted injury, which the modern listener should not misread as a serious attempt, but should understand as a piece of theatrical pressure applied to a woman who had been refusing him, and which Maria Fitzherbert had recognised as theatre, and had nonetheless been moved by, because the prince had wept genuinely in her presence, and had said, in the privacy of her drawing-room, that he could not live without her. She had agreed, in the autumn of 1785, to marry him. The marriage took place secretly on the 15th of December, 1785, in the drawing-room of her house in Park Street, Mayfair, conducted by a clergyman of the Church of England who had been promised £300 and a future bishopric for his trouble. The marriage was illegal twice over. It was illegal under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, because the prince was 23 and had not obtained his father's consent. And because his father would never have consented, it was illegal under the Act of Settlement of 1701, because Maria Fitzherbert was a Catholic, and the Act of Settlement provided that any heir to the throne who married a Catholic forfeited his place in the succession. The prince had, in a single ceremony in a Mayfair drawing-room, committed both technical illegalities at once. He had also, in the same ceremony, married a woman he genuinely loved, and who genuinely loved him, and the relationship between them would last, with interruptions and rupturings, for nearly 30 years. The Queen did not know. The King did not know. The household at Kew, in the winter of 1785, was unaware that the heir to the throne had married a Catholic widow in a private drawing-room, and was, in the eyes of his own conscience and the eyes of the Catholic Church, married to her in the sight of God. The Prince and Mrs. Fitzherbert lived, in the years that followed, as discreetly as a man of his rank and a woman of her newly elevated profile could live. They did not appear at court together. They did not acknowledge the marriage in public. They were seen together at private parties and at the houses of mutual friends. They had no children, although there is a long and largely unverifiable tradition that there was at least one pregnancy that did not come to term. They were, in the privacy of the world they had made together, the closest thing the prince ever had to a happy marriage. The marriage became known to the political world by gradual degrees. By 1787, when the prince's debts had reached the point at which he had to ask Parliament for a settlement, the rumour of his Catholic marriage was being used against him in the House of Commons. The Whig politician Charles James Fox, who was the prince's closest political ally, and who knew or strongly suspected that the marriage had taken place, was forced to stand up in the Commons and deny that any such marriage had occurred. He did so. He had not consulted the prince before doing so. The prince, when he learned of Fox's denial, was furious. The prince said privately to his friends that Fox had committed perjury in his service. The prince did not, however, contradict the denial in public. The marriage remained in the formal political record a marriage that had not happened. Maria Fitzherbert, who had been told nothing of the parliamentary denial in advance, was deeply wounded. She withdrew from the prince's company for 6 months. He pursued her. She returned. The relationship continued, with the public denial standing. The Queen, by 1787, knew. She had been told by one of her ladies of the bedchamber, who had heard the rumour from a friend of Mrs. Fitzherbert's friend, and the Queen had asked her son directly, in a private audience at Windsor in the late spring whether the rumour was true. The prince had bowed and had said, in the formal language he used with his mother, that he could not in honour deny what was being said, but that he could not, in law, acknowledge it. The Queen had understood. She had not pressed him further. She had returned to her embroidery. She had not, in the conversation, told him what she thought of him. She had not, by the testimony of those who knew her in those years, told anyone in the household what she thought of him. She had absorbed the knowledge in the manner she absorbed all knowledge about her eldest son, which was privately and without complaint, and she had continued to receive him at court on the formal occasions when his attendance was required. The political alignments of the prince in this period were the more difficult problem for the Queen because they took place in public and could not be absorbed in private. The prince had attached himself, from the age of 19, to Charles James Fox and the Foxite Whigs, who were the leading parliamentary opposition to his father's government. Fox was a brilliant, dissolute, charismatic politician, 15 years older than the prince, who held court at Brooks's Club in St. James's Street, and who had assembled around himself the sons of every Whig grandee in the country. The prince had been delighted to be admitted to this circle. He had spent his evenings at Brooks's playing faro and drinking and listening to Fox argue against his father's ministers, and he had taken from these evenings the political opinions that would define his public life. He was, by 20, a Foxite Whig in everything but the name. He spoke against his father's American policy, although the war was over by then. He spoke against his father's choice of ministers. He spoke against his father's resistance to Catholic emancipation, which was a Foxite cause. He spoke, in private to his Whig friends and in not quite private to anyone who would listen, of the day when he would be king and would put Fox and his friends into office. The king's reaction to this was not anger, which would have been the easier reaction for the family to manage. The king's reaction was a cold withdrawal. He stopped receiving his eldest son except on formal occasions. He stopped speaking to him at family dinners. He spoke about him in the household only when business required it. He cut his establishment's funding twice, in 1784 and 1786, to amounts that did not approach the prince's expenditures and that left the household at Carlton House borrowing from moneylenders at usurious rates. The Queen, in this period, attempted on several occasions to broker between her husband and her eldest son. She failed on each. The king would not be moved. The prince would not be moved. The Queen, who had spent her own childhood watching the careful protocols of her mother's modest court at Miro, and who had not, in her own upbringing, encountered the spectacle of a father and a son who would not speak to each other, found herself in a household in which the two men she loved most in the world were not on speaking terms, and the household had no means of repair available to it, and she was expected by everyone, including her husband and her son, to keep both of them in her affections and to take, in public, no side. She took, in private, her husband's side. She thought the prince had behaved badly. She thought the prince had spent money he did not have on things he did not need. She thought the prince had attached himself to a political faction that was opposed to everything his father stood for. She thought the prince had made a marriage that he had no right to make, and that had wounded a woman who deserved better treatment than she had received. She thought, in the most painful corner of her private accounts, that the boy she had brushed hair in the nursery at Kew had grown into a man she did not entirely recognize and could not entirely defend. She did not say any of this to him. She continued to receive him at court. She continued in his presence to be a queen and a mother of the formal kind. She continued to write him, on his birthdays and at Christmas, formal notes of maternal good wishes that did not reference any of the private difficulties of his life. She continued in private to pray for him. She prayed for him by name. She prayed for him every night before she slept. The praying was the only private acknowledgement of her difficulty with him that the household ever observed, because Madame Schwellenberg, who knew the Queen's prayers by listening at the door of her bedchamber, would later report to her niece that the Queen had prayed for the Prince of Wales every night, without exception, for the last 35 years of her life, and that the praying had become, in the last decade of those years, the longest single prayer the Queen said. The other sons, in the same period, were going to sea, going to the army, going to Hanover, going to Germany, going to whatever profession their father had selected for them. The pattern that the king had begun with William, who had gone into the navy at 13 in 1779, became, in the 1780s and the 1790s, the pattern that defined the lives of all the spares. The principle was that a royal son who could not inherit must be useful. The principle was that uselessness in a royal son produced the kind of trouble the heir was producing, and that the way to prevent the trouble in the remaining sons was to give each of them a profession that would occupy their time and their ambitions and their bodies for the productive years of their lives. The king believed in this principle. He applied it to each of the spares in turn. The application was, in every case, against the wishes of the son himself, who had not asked to be sent away from his family, and who learned slowly across the years of his exile that the king's love had limits, and that the limits had a foreign address. William, who had gone to sea at 13, was the easiest case. He had asked for it. He had wanted to be a sailor. He was, by temperament, suited to it. He served on home stations as a midshipman until 1781, when he was sent to North America as part of the squadron commanded by Admiral Digby. He fought, in a minor capacity, in the closing engagements of the American War. He was at New York during the British evacuation. He was, by 16, a lieutenant. By 18, he was captain of his own frigate. By 20, he was on the West India station, where he met Horatio Nelson, who was a captain on the same station, and the friendship between them began that would last until Nelson's death at Trafalgar 22 years later. William was, in his early 20s, the model royal sailor present at his post, capable in his command, popular with his men, respected by his fellow officers, and visibly removed from the embarrassments his elder brother was generating in London. The king was pleased with William. The Queen wrote him affectionate letters which he replied to in handwriting that did not improve over the years, and that she could sometimes barely decipher. William's first major attachment, formed on the West India station in 1786 when he was 20, was to a daughter of one of the planters of Antigua, a young woman named Wrottesley. The prince proposed to her. He wrote to his father asking for permission to marry. The king refused, on grounds the king did not bother to articulate to his son, but which the king articulated to his ministers, and which were the obvious grounds, that the daughter of a colonial planter was not a suitable wife for a royal prince, that the marriage would be void under the Royal Marriages Act in any case, and that William was to be recalled from the West Indies and given a different command in waters where he could not form further such attachments. William was recalled. He came home in 1787 to find that he had been promoted to captain of HMS Pegasus and assigned to the Newfoundland station, which was about as far from any planter's daughter as the Navy could send him. He served there for 3 years. The Queen wrote to him weekly. He wrote back when he could. The handwriting did not improve. Frederick, the spare, was sent in 1781 to Hanover, where he had been nominally Bishop of Osnabrück since the age of 7 months, and where his father had decided he was to be trained as a German soldier in the Prussian tradition. He was 18 when he arrived in Hanover. He was given a military tutor, who was a colonel of the Prussian army on secondment, and he was given a regiment, and he was given the German court life of an electoral prince of Hanover, which was a smaller and quieter version of the British court he had left behind. He stayed in Hanover for 7 years. He returned to England in 1787 at 24, a serving general with a reputation for personal courage and an excellent command of military German. He was, by his return, his father's clear favourite of all the sons. The king received him at court with an embrace in front of the household, that the household had not seen the king give the Prince of Wales since the latter had been a small child. The Queen also embraced him. Frederick had been, in his absence, the son she could write to without complication, and his return restored to her the household ally she had not had during the years of her growing estrangement from the heir. Edward was sent in 1785, at 17, to Geneva, to be educated by Swiss tutors of military and scholarly accomplishment. He hated Geneva. He hated the climate, the language, the food, the tutors, and the city itself, which was not to him a city at all, but a small Calvinist town that fancied itself a republic. He wrote to his father weekly asking to be recalled. The king did not recall him. He wrote to his mother weekly asking her to intercede with the king. She interceded. The king refused her interventions politely and unmovably. Edward was kept in Geneva for 5 years. He learned German and French and Italian. He developed the rigid sense of personal duty that would in his later regiments become legendary and ruinous. He left Geneva in 1790 at 22, after a quarrel with his tutors that involved his having struck one of them with a riding crop, and he was sent immediately to Gibraltar to take up a colonel's command of the 7th Royal Fusiliers. He would spend most of the next 2 decades on imperial garrison duty, in Gibraltar, in Quebec, in Halifax, in the West Indies, and in Gibraltar again, and he would not see his mother face to face for stretches as long as 7 years. He wrote to her constantly. She kept his letters. She read them in the evenings in her drawing room, after the king had gone to his closet, and she would, by the testimony of her ladies, occasionally smile in a private way at his accounts of garrison life and his complaints about his officers, and his pleas for promotion that the king was not giving him. Augustus was sent in 1786 at 13 to Göttingen, the German university where the British royal family had been sending its scholars and its asthmatic younger sons for half a century. He thrived there in a way Edward had not thrived in Geneva. He had the bookish temperament, he had the language, he had the asthma, which the German climate did not aggravate as the Swiss had aggravated Edward's other irritations. He stayed at Göttingen for 6 years. He learned Greek and Hebrew and modern philosophy and the new German biblical criticism that was, in the late 18th century, beginning to undo the assumptions on which the established Church of England rested. He came home in 1792, a Whig in everything but the family name, with views on Catholic emancipation and parliamentary reform, and the abolition of the slave trade that placed him at odds with his father on every major political question of the age. He was, his mother understood, the son who had read his way out of the family politics. She was not unsympathetic. She had her own gentle scepticisms about some of the king's positions, which she did not voice in public. She could not, however, openly side with a son against the king. Augustus understood this. Augustus did not press her. The relationship between them was, in the years after his return, warm and slightly conspiratorial, the way a relationship between a politically dissident son and an intelligent mother who agrees with him in private and cannot say so in public must be. Adolphus, the youngest, was sent to Göttingen in 1786 at 12 with his brother Augustus. He came home 4 years later. He was the easiest of the boys, the one who quarrelled with no one. the cheerful, obedient student who returned home with adequate Greek and good German, and no particular opinions on anything controversial. He went, in his 20s, to Hanover to take a commission in the family's German regiments, and he spent most of the next 2 decades there, returning to England only on short visits. He was the son the king did not worry about. He was also the son who, by the accident of his eventual marriage to Augusta of Hesse-Kassel and the survival of their daughter Mary Adelaide, would become the great-great-grandfather of King George VI and the great-great-great-grandfather of the present British royal line. The dynasty would, in the next century, descend through Adolphus more than through any of his brothers, although neither he nor his mother could have foreseen this in 1790. He was, in his mother's mind in the 1790s, the son who was abroad and who wrote home and who caused her no anxiety, and that, in those years, was sufficient. Ernest was sent in 1786 to Göttingen with Augustus and Adolphus, and then, at 15, to Hanover for cavalry training. He was, by 16, a cornet in the Hanoverian Hussars. He served in the campaigns of the Allied armies against revolutionary France in 1793 and 1794. He was wounded at the Battle of Tournai in May 1794, struck across the left side of his face by a French sabre that opened a long, deep wound from his eye to his jaw. The wound healed badly. It left a scar that would mark his face for the rest of his life and that would distort, in cold weather, the function of his left eye. He returned to England later that year to recuperate, and he showed his mother the scar in a private audience at Windsor. And she had embraced him with the particular careful tenderness that mothers extend to children who have been hurt in ways the mother had not been able to prevent. She had then, in the private letter she wrote to her brother in Mecklenburg the following week, described Ernest's wound and Ernest's recovery and Ernest's manner since his return in a tone of complicated maternal anxiety that her surviving letters to her brother do not contain about any of the other sons. Ernest had returned, she wrote, with the look of a man who had decided something while he was lying in the field hospital, and she had not been able to determine what the thing was, and she was uneasy. She was right to be uneasy. The thing he had decided would shape the next 40 years of his life, and would, in time, place him at the centre of the most persistent rumours of family scandal that any of her sons would generate. By 1795, Charlotte had 6 sons abroad simultaneously. William was on naval station. Frederick had returned from Hanover, but was now serving on the continent as commander of the British forces in Flanders. Edward was in Gibraltar. Ernest was in Hanover. Augustus was in Italy, having gone abroad again for his health after the brief return from Göttingen. Adolphus was in Hanover with Ernest. The post from each of these stations to London took between 4 and 8 weeks each way. The Queen wrote to all of them. She received letters from all of them. She kept the letters in locked drawers in her writing desk at Windsor. The household, in the mid-1790s, was a household whose children had been dispersed across Europe in the service of the dynastic principle that royal sons must be useful, and the dispersal had not, on balance, been worth the cost it had exacted from the Queen, who had bound her life to her children, and who had not been able to refuse the King's insistence that her children must leave her in order to learn what royal sons were supposed to learn. She wrote in 1796 to her brother that her house at Windsor had 10 bedrooms, and she slept in one of them, and that 9 of the bedrooms were prepared every night for children who would not be sleeping in them, and that she had asked Madame Schwellenberg to stop instructing the maids to prepare the unused rooms, but Madame Schwellenberg had refused to stop, on the grounds that a child might come home unannounced, and the room must be ready. The Queen had not pressed Madame Schwellenberg on the point. The rooms were prepared every night for the rest of her life. The pattern of the brothers' attachments to women they could not marry, long, faithful, illegitimate, dynastically useless, became across the 1790s the defining private feature of the Queen's middle age. The pattern began with the heir. It continued with William. It continued with Augustus. It continued with Edward. It continued with Ernest. Adolphus would, eventually, marry a permitted German princess and produce a legitimate daughter, and would be the only one of the brothers who broke the pattern. Every other son formed, in his 20s or his 30s, a long permanent union with a woman whom the Royal Marriages Act of 1772 prevented him from marrying, and the Queen would learn of these unions one by one, and would receive them, in her mind, one by one, and would be required to take a public position on each, and the public positions would not, in the end, be consistent, because the unions themselves were not consistent, and her relationship to each son was not consistent, and she was a mother, and not a moral philosopher, and she did the best she could. The heir's union with Maria Fitzherbert was already established by 1786 and continued with the long interruption of his public marriage to Caroline of Brunswick from 1795 onward until 1811. Mrs. Fitzherbert lived in her own house in Mayfair. She received him there. She was received by some members of the family. Frederick visited her, William visited her, Augustus visited her, but she was never received at court, and the Queen never met her face to face, although the Queen sent her, in 1799, a small present at Christmas, conveyed by Frederick, of a cut-glass bowl filled with German marzipan, with a note in the Queen's own hand-reading, for Mrs. F., with Her Majesty's compliments. Mrs. Fitzherbert kept the note for the rest of her life. The Queen did not write any further note. The cut-glass bowl was the only acknowledgment the Queen ever gave that she knew her son had a wife who was not his wife, and a marriage that was not his marriage. It was, in its small way, an acknowledgment. Mrs. Fitzherbert understood it as such. The note was framed and hung in her drawing-room, where the Queen's son saw it and was moved by it, and did not speak of it. William's union with Dorothea Jordan began in 1791, when he was 26, and had returned from his naval career to take up residence at Bushey House in Hertfordshire. Dorothea Jordan was an actress, 4 years older than the Prince, one of the most popular performers on the London stage, a comedienne of particular gift, and the mother already of 4 illegitimate children by 2 previous men. She was warm, funny, devoted, and entirely unfussed by her own social position. She moved into Bushey House in 1791. She lived there with the Prince for the next 20 years. She bore him 10 children. They were known as the Fitz-Clarences. The eldest, George, was born in 1794 and would eventually be created Earl of Munster. The second, Henry, was born in 1795. The remaining 8 followed at intervals over the next 16 years. The children took their father's title as a courtesy and his royal blood as a private fact, and they were raised at Bushey House in a domestic happiness that, by all contemporary accounts, was greater than any happiness the royal house produced in any of its legitimate establishments. The Queen visited Bushey. She visited it once a year, in the autumn, at a date arranged in advance. She received the Fitz-Clarence children individually in the drawing-room. She gave them small presents. She kissed each of them on the forehead. She did not, when she returned to Windsor, speak of them publicly. She did not, when she returned, speak of them privately to the King, who knew of their existence but who did not inquire. The visits to Bushey were the Queen's private acknowledgment of grandchildren she could not officially own. She made them annually for 20 years. Edward's union with Julie de Saint-Laurent began in Quebec in 1791, when he was 24 and she was 28, and they were introduced at a private dinner in the house of a French-Canadian merchant. She was a French aristocrat by birth, of modest family, who had fled the Revolution, and was making her living in colonial Canada by giving music lessons. The prince fell in love with her at the dinner and proposed she become his domestic companion within the month. She accepted. She moved into his residence at Quebec. She moved with him in the years that followed to Gibraltar and to Halifax and to Geneva and back to Gibraltar and finally to England. They lived together for 27 years in establishments across the British Empire, faithfully and devotedly, without children, in a partnership that resembled a marriage in every respect except the legal one. The Queen knew of Julie. The Queen wrote to Julie, on 2 occasions, polite notes in French. The Queen never met her. The relationship was, by the standards of the brothers' attachments, the least scandalous, the most discreet, and the least productive of complications. It would end only in 1818, when the death of Princess Charlotte forced Edward to marry a German princess, and Julie was retired to a house in France with a pension and a degree of dignity that the dynasty owed her, and that Edward, to his credit, was determined that she should have. Augustus made the most romantic and the most legally complicated of the unions. In Rome in the spring of 1793, at the age of 20, he met Lady Augusta Murray, the daughter of the Earl of Dunmore, who was travelling on the continent with her mother. She was 24. They fell in love quickly and entirely. They married each other in Rome on the 4th of April, 1793, in a ceremony conducted by an English clergyman they had both befriended. The marriage was illegal under the Royal Marriages Act because Augustus was 19 at the time of the ceremony and had not obtained his father's consent. They returned to England. They married each other again in London on the 5th of December, 1793, in a ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square, under the names of Mr. Augustus Frederick and Miss Augusta Murray, without disclosing his royal identity to the officiating clergyman. They lived together for the next 7 years. They had 2 children, a son in 1794 and a daughter in 1801. The marriage was challenged in court by the king in 1794. The marriage was declared void in a hearing of the Court of Arches in July 1794, on the grounds that the prince had not obtained his father's consent under the Act of 1772. The 2 children were declared illegitimate. The Court of Arches did not, however, separate the parents. Augustus and Lady Augusta continued to live as husband and wife until 1801, when the strain of his increasingly chronic asthma and his father's increasingly hostile refusal to acknowledge the relationship caused him to retire to Berlin for his health, and the marriage, in any practical sense, ended. He paid Lady Augusta an annual allowance for the rest of her life. He visited the children. He never legally married her, and he never legally married anyone else either, until his second secret marriage in 1831 to Lady Cecilia Buggin, which was also void under the Act of 1772, and which the Queen did not live to see. The Queen had liked Lady Augusta. The Queen had received her briefly at court before the marriage was annulled. The Queen had sent her, after the annulment, an annual present at Christmas, which Lady Augusta had accepted with a quiet gratitude that the Queen recognised. The Queen had also, after the annulment, declined to receive the children on the grounds that they were now illegitimate, and the dignity of the court could not officially recognise them. She had sent them small presents. She had asked after them in private correspondence with Augustus. She had never, in their lifetimes, met them. Ernest's union, when it came, was the most contentious. He married, in May 1815, his cousin Frederica of Solms-Braunfels, who had been twice married previously and was the divorced or widowed wife of 2 minor German princes. The first husband, Prince Frederick Louis of Prussia, had divorced her in 1799 amid scandal. The second husband, Prince Frederick William of Solms-Braunfels, had died in 1814 in circumstances that some at the German courts considered suspicious, with a persistent rumour that Frederica had hastened his death in order to be free to marry Ernest, with whom she had been in a close correspondence for several years. The rumour was almost certainly false. The rumour persisted regardless. Frederica was, in the assessment of the British court, the most unsuitable royal duchess the family had yet produced, and Charlotte refused to receive her. She kept Frederica away from court, away from Windsor, and at the far edge of family correspondence. The refusal lasted for the rest of Charlotte's life. Ernest and Frederica lived mostly in Berlin and Hanover. They had one son, born in 1819, who would eventually become King of Hanover after his father. They were a married couple whom the Queen had refused to receive, and the refusal was painful, and Ernest never forgave her, and Charlotte never softened. It was the only one of her son's attachments that produced a complete and permanent rupture between her and her son's chosen woman. Ernest, the son she nonetheless loved. Frederica, the daughter-in-law she would not have in her house. The contradiction was visible to the entire family. The contradiction was never resolved. The exception to the pattern was the heir's other marriage, a public one. In 1795, when the heir was 32 and his debts had grown beyond what any private settlement could clear, his father agreed to pay them only on the condition that he marry a Protestant German princess and produce a legitimate heir. The candidate selected, with insufficient consultation of the prince's preferences, was Princess Caroline of Brunswick, the daughter of the king's sister Augusta. She arrived in England in April 1795. The prince met her at St. James's, took one look at her, called for a glass of brandy, and retired to a chair to drink it. He had been told by friends who had met her on the continent that she would not suit him. He had hoped his friends had been mistaken. They had not been mistaken. He went through with the wedding ceremony on the 8th of April, 1795, in a state of barely controlled disinclination. He went through with the wedding night in a state of frank drunkenness. Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate child of the marriage, was conceived that single night and was born 9 months later. The marriage was, for all practical purposes, over by the end of the first year. The Prince and Princess of Wales lived separately from 1797 onward. They quarrelled in public. They quarrelled in the newspapers. They quarrelled, eventually, before parliamentary commissions of inquiry. The marriage would not be formally ended until Caroline's death in 1821, and this story will not follow it through every twist, because the marriage and the subsequent Queen Caroline affair of 1820 are the subject of another evening, and the listener who wishes to follow Caroline's story should refer to that episode. What matters for tonight is what the marriage meant for Charlotte. The Queen had watched her son marry a woman he could not stand in order to fulfill the dynastic obligation that an heir produce a legitimate child, and the marriage had produced one child, and that child was a daughter. And the daughter was the only legitimate grandchild Charlotte would ever have, and the marriage was a disaster. The Queen could see clearly, and could not say so, because she had been the one who, with the king, had pressed the prince to marry. She had blood on her hands, in the secluded sense of those words, and she knew it, and she would think about it on and off for the rest of her life. An högsta målsbörja. By 1800 the pattern was, in any case, complete. Every one of the Queen's surviving adult sons was attached, formally or informally, to a woman he could not legitimately call his wife. The heir was married twice, once illegally to Maria Fitzherbert, and once disastrously to Caroline of Brunswick. Frederick had been married since 1791 to Frederica of Prussia, in a permitted dynastic match that had produced no children, and that the Duke and Duchess had effectively abandoned within 5 years, both of them living separately, and the Duchess living in the country with 40 dogs. William was at Bushy House with Dorothea Jordan and the growing tribe of Fitzclarences. Edward was in Gibraltar with Julie de Saint Laurent. Augustus had been declared unmarried by the Court of Arches and was living quietly with the woman he still considered his wife. Ernest was unmarried and would remain so until 1815. Adolphus was unmarried and would remain so until 1818. Charlotte had 9 adult sons, and not one legitimate grandchild beyond Princess Charlotte of Wales. And Princess Charlotte was a small child of 4 in 1800, raised in the catastrophe of her parents' marriage by a governess and visited rarely by either of them. The dynasty's future, in the Queen's private accounting in 1800, depended on a 4-year-old girl whose parents could not stand each other and whose grandfather was a 56-year-old king whose mind had already broken twice and who would, in the next decade, break a 3rd time and would not recover. The Queen was 56 herself. She had been the mother of kings for 37 years. She was tired. She kept the household running. She wrote letters. She visited Bushy in the autumns. She sent presents at Christmas to children she could not officially acknowledge. She prayed for the Prince of Wales every night. She tried, in the only ways available to her, to hold a family together that the law her husband had passed in 1772 had ensured would not hold. The relationship each son had with his father was, by the turn of the new century, the kind of relationship that had taken a long time to settle into its final shape, and that would not change after it had settled. The king had been 33 years old when he had committed himself to the experiment of being a different kind of royal father from the one his grandfather had been to his father, and he had been 70 when he had effectively ceased to be a father in any sense at all, by the 3rd and final breakdown of his mind. In those 37 years he had failed, in the way the most determined men sometimes fail, to break the family pattern he had set out to break. The pattern of the Hanoverian father who could not love his sons in the way they needed had reasserted itself with variations in every one of his relationships with the surviving boys, and Charlotte had watched the reassertion happen and had not been able to alter it. The heir was, by the time the king's final illness began, a son the king had not received in private for the better part of 15 years. The two of them met only at official court functions, where they exchanged the formal bows of state and the formal greetings of state, and almost no words. The king did not approve of his eldest son's manner of living. The eldest son did not approve of his father's manner of governing. Neither would yield. The Queen brokered the formal meetings. She would, before each one, send a small note to her son in advance, suggesting the topics that might be safe to raise. The heir often ignored the notes. The king often ignored the heir. The meetings were brief and unhappy. The Queen would, in her drawing room after each one, lay her embroidery in her lap for a long minute, and look at the fire and not speak, and Madame Schwellenberg would bring her a glass of cordial without being asked. The king's coldness to his eldest son was the longest political coldness in the British monarchy of the period. It was older than the American War. It was older than the French Revolution. It was older than several of the prime ministers who had served under the king during it. The Prince of Wales, in private to Lord Holland in 1809, said of his father that the king had ruined his life by being a cold, moralizing, withholding presence who had never once praised him, and the prince had said it without bitterness, in the way a man says a thing he has long since stopped being able to be bitter about, and Lord Holland had recorded the remark in his journal that night, and the remark had passed by gradual leakages into the historical record. The Queen never read Lord Holland's journal. The Queen knew, without reading it, exactly what her son had said. Frederick's relationship with the king was warmer, till it broke. The king had loved Frederick openly. The king had relied on Frederick during the years of the prince's army command. The king had appointed Frederick Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in 1798, in a position of immense military and political consequence, and Frederick had served in the position for the next 11 years, with a competence that the king had been pleased with, and that the army had largely respected. The breaking point came in 1809, with the Mary Ann Clark scandal, which was the public revelation that Frederick's former mistress, Mary Ann Clark, had been selling army commissions through her connection with the Duke. Frederick had not, by the inquiry's conclusion, been directly involved in the selling. He had not personally pocketed any of the money. He had, however, allowed his name to be used in a manner that had permitted the commerce to occur, and the parliamentary inquiry had found that he was guilty of the lesser charge of having permitted what he should not have permitted. The king, on the inquiry's verdict, had been forced to require Frederick's resignation as commander-in-chief. The king had not wanted to require it. The king had wept in private to the Queen on the morning he signed the letter accepting Frederick's resignation. Frederick had been hurt by the resignation in a manner the king had not anticipated, and had not been able to repair. The king, who had loved this son openly and unreservedly for 45 years, had not been able to find the words to say to Frederick that he understood the political necessity of the resignation, but did not believe his son to have acted dishonourably. The words had not been said. Frederick had retired to his country house at Oatlands for a year. The king had reinstated him as commander-in-chief in 1811, after his own descent into final madness made the political question of the army command moot. By then the relationship between father and son was repaired only formally. The warmth that had been the defining quality of the relationship for 40 years was after 1809 never quite the same. Frederick continued to visit Windsor. The king, by 1811, was no longer in a state to know whether his second son was visiting or not. William's relationship with the king had always been the easiest of the Spares relationships, because William had been at sea since he was 13 and had not been part of the daily household in any of the difficult years. He had visited home on leave. He had been received by his father with the affectionate courtesy the king extended to children he had not had to manage. William was, in his middle age, a man the king liked without entirely respecting, the way one might like a younger brother who had made his own way in the world, but who had not, perhaps, made it in the way one would oneself have made it. The king was uneasy about Dorothea Jordan, but he did not press William on the question. He was uneasy about the 10 Fitzclarences, but he did not press William on them either. He had, by William's middle age, used up most of his energy on the older boys. William was, in the king's later years, the son he did not quarrel with because there was nothing in particular to quarrel about. Edward's relationship with the king was the saddest of the relationships, because Edward had wanted his father's approval more than any of the brothers, and had been least successful in obtaining it. The boy who had been sent to Geneva at 17 had spent the next 30 years writing his father letters that were pleading in their tone and ambitious in their content. He wrote asking for promotion. He wrote asking for reassignment. He wrote asking for permission to return to England. And then, when refused, he wrote asking for permission to remain longer in his current posting. And then, when permitted, he wrote asking for some sign that his service was valued. The signs did not come. The king's responses to Edward, when the king responded, were brief, formal, and unencouraging. The king, in private letters to the Queen about Edward, expressed a doubt about Edward's judgment that was rooted in the Geneva Quarrel of 1790, and that the king had never been able to set aside Edward. In private letters to the Queen about the king, expressed a longing for paternal recognition that the Queen knew she could not relieve. She mediated. She passed on, from each side, only what would be received without further offence. She told Edward, repeatedly across the years, that the king's silence was not disapproval, but the king's general inability to express what he felt, and Edward had, by middle age, ceased to believe her. In his own mind, the steady companionship of Madame de Saint Laurent had already become the marriage-like bond of his adult life. He had constructed, in his Halifax and his Quebec and his Gibraltar establishments, the domestic warmth he had been refused at home. He did not need his father's approval any more. He had stopped, by 1810, asking for it. The relationship, at that point, was effectively over. Ernest's relationship with the king was the peculiar one. Ernest was, in the king's later years, the king's favourite of all the sons. The king did not, in those years, have a particular preference for the children he had once known well. The heir was estranged. Frederick was permanently injured by the resignation. William and Edward were physically absent. And Ernest, who had come home from Hanover in his 30s with the scar across his face and the determined Tory politics of a man who had spent his 20s fighting the French Revolution, was the son who appeared at Windsor and stayed and listened to his father's monologues and agreed with them. The king, in his 60s, was an old man who needed an audience for his political opinions, and Ernest was the son who provided it. The king did not see, in this period, what the Queen and the household saw, which was that Ernest's agreement with the king was the agreement of a son who had figured out how to win his father's affection by speaking the language the father wanted to hear, and that the agreement was, in its private interior, not the simple loyalty it appeared to be on the surface. Ernest, in the king's last sane years, was the only son who came to Windsor regularly. The king received him warmly. The household watched. Charlotte was glad of the affection between them, and was also, in her private accounts, faintly disturbed by it, because she had known Ernest as a boy, and she had known her husband for 40 years, and she understood, in a manner she did not articulate even to herself, that the affection was not what it seemed. Augustus's relationship with the king had collapsed in 1794, when the king had Augustus's marriage to Lady Augusta Murray annulled by the Court of Arches and had not been repaired since. The king had refused Augustus a regiment. The king had refused Augustus a public role. The king had refused Augustus permission to return to England for an extended period in the 1790s, with the result that Augustus had remained abroad for most of his 20s and 30s, and had developed, in those years, the increasingly Whiggish political views that placed him at odds with his father on every major question. By the time Augustus returned to England permanently in 1804, the relationship between him and the king had attenuated into a polite formality that did not pretend to be more than it was. They met at official court functions. They exchanged the necessary bows. They did not, in any substantial sense, speak. Augustus settled into the role of the family's scholar and the family's quiet dissident, surrounding himself with books and with Whig friends and with a circle of intellectual acquaintances that included some of the most distinguished men in London, and he made his peace with the absence of his father's approval by ceasing, in his late 20s, to require it. Adolphus's relationship with the king was the one that came closest to the king's original intention for what a father-son relationship in this dynasty should be. Adolphus had been the easiest of the boys. He had been sent to Hanover in his early 20s and had served there for 2 decades without scandal. He had asked his father for nothing he could not be given. He had returned to England on visits with the appropriate respect and the appropriate stories. The king was fond of him without complication. They never quarrelled. They had nothing to quarrel about. Adolphus, in middle age, would remember his father with the affection of a son who had been treated well, and the affection would be one of the small kindnesses Adolphus carried into his own life, and into his own eventual marriage, and into the daughter he would produce, the daughter who would become the great-grandmother of the present royal line, the chain of small kindnesses that ran from the king's affection for his youngest surviving son through Adolphus's affection for his own daughter, into the broader maternal warmth of the Cambridge household in the next century, was the one piece of evidence that the king's experiment in fatherhood had not entirely failed. It had failed with most of the boys. It had succeeded, in a small way, with the last of them. The relationships the sons had with their mother were a different mapping, and a more painful one in some cases, because the mother had been more present than the father in the early years, and had been less able to fail them in the way the father had failed them, and the failures, when they came in the form of a particular kind of withholding that mothers manage and fathers do not. Charlotte was, by every contemporary account, a woman of natural affection and considerable personal kindness. She was also a woman who had been told from the age of 17 that her affection had to be administered on a schedule that did not bend to the particular need of any one child, and who had spent 40 years administering her affection on that schedule, and who had, by the time her sons were grown men, found that the administration had become the affection itself, and that she could not quite, with any of them, get to the warmth underneath. The heir was the son she found hardest to give the warmth to. She had known, since the letter to her brother in 1779, that George needed a particular kind of love she had not been able to provide, and she had spent the rest of his life unable to provide it. He visited her at formal occasions. He wrote her formal letters. He brought her formal gifts at Christmas. She received him with the formal warmth of a queen and a mother, and she could not in his presence reach the underneath, and she knew it. And he knew it. They were by his middle age, two adults who had once been mother and small child, and who had never quite recovered from the distance that the 18th century royal nursery had placed between them. She wrote to her brother in 1812, when George had just become Prince Regent and was 49 years old, that her son was the man she loved most in the world and could speak to least, and that she had not known, when she had borne him at 18, that this would be the cost of having been the mother of a prince. Her brother wrote back, in his patient manner, that this was the cost of having been the mother of a prince, and that the cost had been paid by many women before her, and would be paid by many after her, and that she should not blame herself. She kept his letter. She read it over many times. She did not, in any subsequent letter, refer to the matter again. The praying for him every night was the form her love for him eventually took. The praying was a love that did not require him to know it, and that was the love she could give. Frederick was the son she could speak to. He was the son she wrote to without difficulty. He was the son who came to Windsor and sat with her in the drawing-room and asked her about her gardens and listened to her answers, and who told her about his army business in a tone that did not require her to follow the technical details, and did not condescend to her either. Frederick was, after the king's final illness began in 1810, her most constant adult companion. He visited her weekly when he was in London. He wrote her almost daily when he was not. The relationship between them in the last decade of her life was the closest she had to the relationship she had imagined, as a young mother, that she would eventually have with each of her grown sons. She had it with one of them. She was grateful for it. William was the son who wrote her the cheerful, illegible letters from Bushey. She read them with affection. She replied to them in her own careful hand. She visited him in the autumns. She held the Fitzclarence children on her knee and asked them about their lessons. She was, by William's middle age, an indulgent mother to him in a way she had not entirely been to any of the others, perhaps because William was the son who asked least of her and gave most. The relationship was warm and uncomplicated. It was not deep, but it did not need to be. Edward was the son she wrote to most. The letters from him from Gibraltar and Halifax and Quebec across 30 years filled 3 locked drawers of her writing desk. She kept them. She read them in the evenings. She replied to them weekly. She was, for Edward, the mother who had not been able to give him his father's approval, but who had at least given him her own, in the form of letters that did not fail to arrive. He named one of his illegitimate children, conceived with a previous mistress before the long attachment to Madame de Saint-Laurent began. After her, she knew of the child. She sent the child a small present once a year. The relationship between her and Edward was the relationship of a mother who had loved her son patiently across distance and had been loved by him in return. It was the second closest of the relationships the Queen had with her surviving boys. It was, by 1818, the last great mother-son intimacy she had known with any of them. Ernest was the difficult one. The son she had not entirely been able to love as a boy had grown into a man who would not let her be criticised in his hearing. He defended her in public when the family was quarrelling. He came to Windsor when she asked. He stood on the few occasions when his brothers tried to speak against her at family councils in a manner that ended the discussion. He loved her, in his peculiar way, more steadily than any of the others. She could not return it in the same form. She received it. She thanked him in the small ways available to her. She refused, however, to receive his wife. The refusal was the limit of what her conscience would permit her to do, and Ernest understood the limit, and he never asked her to revise it, and he continued to love her without revising his own marriage either. But it was the strangest of the mother-son relationships, the one that asked the most of both of them, and gave back, in the end, a kind of mutual recognition that had survived everything the family had failed to do for either of them. Augustus was warm, easy, intellectual. He visited her at Windsor in the years after his return to England. He read aloud to her in the evenings. He taught her, in informal conversations over a number of years, the rudiments of the new German biblical criticism, which she found alarming and fascinating in equal measure. He was the son who could discuss ideas with her without requiring her to defend the king's positions, and she was grateful for the conversation. The relationship between them was uncomplicated and affectionate. He would be with her, at Bath, in the last weeks of her life. Adolphus, the youngest, the easy one, the son who had never quarrelled with anyone, was the son she had worried about least, and the son who, by the accidents of biology and survival, would carry the dynasty into the next century. He wrote her affectionate letters from Hanover. He visited her on his returns. He named his daughter, when she was eventually born in 1833, Mary Adelaide, in tribute to a great-aunt and to his sister-in-law, and Mary Adelaide would become the mother of Queen Mary, who would marry George V, and the present British royal line descends through Mary Adelaide and Adolphus, the son Charlotte had worried about least, in a piece of dynastic irony that the Queen would not live to see, and that she would, if she had lived to see it, have found both pleasing and obscurely sad. The son she had worried about least was the one whose blood survived. The sons she had worried about most had, between them, no legitimate descendants in the present royal house. Ernest is the son who needs his own chapter, because Ernest was the son around whom the family's anxiety gathered most thickly, and because Ernest is the son the general listener knows least about, and because Ernest is the son whose life ran through more rumour and more scandal and more genuine peculiarity than any of the others, and because Charlotte's relationship with him is the relationship that best displays what it cost her to be, the mother of a particular kind of son. He had been born in June 1771 at Buckingham House, the 5th son, into a household that had 4 older brothers and 3 older sisters already in occupation. He had been small at birth and had been considered, for the first months, fragile. He had been the first of the children whose nursery establishment was placed at Kew rather than at St. James's, and he had been raised, in his early years, in the same nursery wing as Augustus and Adolphus, the 2 younger brothers who would be his closest companions in childhood and his most exasperated relatives in adulthood. He had a long face like his father and dark eyes like his mother, and by the age of 5 he had what the household staff described to one another, in the way household staff describe such things, as a watchfulness that the other children did not have. He noticed what was happening in a room. He noticed what people were doing when they thought they were not being noticed. He had, even at 5, the kind of vigilant intelligence that is unsettling in a child, not because the child is doing anything wrong, but because the child is paying attention to wrong things in a way other children of his age do not. He had been sent abroad with Augustus and Adolphus in 1786, at 15 first to Göttingen for his university education, and then, when his father determined that Ernest was better suited to a military career than to scholarship, to Hanover for cavalry training. He had thrived in Hanover. He had the linguistic facility for the German court life. He had the physical aptitude for the cavalry. He had the political instincts of an aristocrat of the older school. He was, by the standards of his uncles in Hanover, an excellent young officer. He returned to England briefly in 1791, and then went back to Germany to take up a Hanoverian regimental command. He served in 1793 and 1794 in the Allied campaigns against revolutionary France. He was at the Battle of Tournai in May 1794. He was struck in the face by a French sabre. The wound was severe. He nearly lost the use of his left eye. He returned to England in late 1794 to recover and remained at Windsor through most of 1795, during which time the Queen saw more of him than she had seen since his childhood, and she watched him recover, slowly, from a wound that had altered his appearance permanently and had altered, she thought, his manner as well. The scar ran from above his left eyebrow down to the line of his jaw. It pulled the skin of his cheek into a slight permanent contraction that made his face, in repose, appear to be set in a half grimace. His left eyelid never entirely recovered its full motion. In cold weather his eye watered, and the skin around it stiffened, and he held a folded handkerchief in his left hand at outdoor functions for the rest of his life, in case the eye should require attention. The scar was visible from across a room. It became the most distinctive feature of his appearance. The cartoonists of London, when Ernest became publicly prominent in the next decade, made the scar the central element of every caricature of him. He minded the cartoons less than the family expected him to. He was, by his own account, proud of the scar. He had earned it in service against the French Revolution, in defence of the old European order he believed in, and he wore it as he would have worn a medal. The second major rumour, which became the dominating shadow of Ernest's public reputation, concerned the death of his valet. On the night of the 31st of May, 1810, Ernest's valet, a Sardinian named Joseph Sellis, was found dead in his bed at St. James's Palace with his throat cut. Ernest had been wounded in his own bedchamber earlier the same night, with cuts to his head and arms that he stated had been inflicted on him by Sellis in an attempted attack, and that he had defended himself against and pursued his attacker out of the room. The official inquiry concluded that Sellis had attacked the Duke, had been driven back to his own bedchamber, and had cut his own throat in despair at the failure of the attack. The verdict was suicide. The verdict was not believed by everyone. The opposition press, and a significant section of the London public, believed that Celis had been murdered by the Duke in order to silence him about something he knew. The thing he knew was variously identified in the gossip of the period as an affair between the Duke and Celis's wife, an affair between the Duke and Celis himself, or some financial impropriety involving the Duke's household accounts. None of these explanations was supported by evidence. The verdict of suicide was, by the assessment of subsequent careful historians, almost certainly correct. The rumour, however, of murder attached itself to Ernest's name and would not be dislodged. He was, for the rest of his life, the prince about whom the public believed the worst. Charlotte's position on these rumours was complicated. She did not believe them, in the sense of believing the darkest rumours told about him, including the accusation that he had murdered his valet. She had known her son. She knew what he was capable of and what he was not. She believed him to be politically reactionary and personally unsettling and difficult in particular ways the family understood, but she did not believe him to be a murderer or an incestuous father. She defended him in private against the worst of the rumours. She defended him in public by refusing to acknowledge that the rumours existed in the queenly manner that did not engage with what the gutter press was saying. She also, however, could not quite love him in the unreserved manner she loved Frederick or Edward or Adolphus. The reservation in her love was not on account of the rumours. The reservation in her love was on account of the man she had always known him to be. She had not entirely been able to love him as a child. She had not entirely been able to love him as a man. He had loved her unreservedly in return, with the peculiar steadiness of a son whose mother's reservation he had recognized early and had simply absorbed and continued past, and the asymmetry between her love for him and his love for her was in the Queen's private accounts of her later years, one of the things she had not been able to reconcile herself to before she died. He married Frederica of Solms-Braunfels in 1815, at Strelitz, in a ceremony attended by his German relatives, but not by his English mother. Charlotte had refused to attend. She had also, as already noted, refused to receive Frederica afterwards. The refusal lasted for the rest of her life. Ernest and Frederica had one son, born in 1819, 6 months after Charlotte's death, named George Frederick Alexander Charles Ernest Augustus, and known eventually as King George V of Hanover, who would reign there from 1851 until his death in 1878. The line of Ernest, the son Charlotte had refused to fully love, continued into the next century as the Hanoverian royal line, separated from the British line by the operation of the Salic law that did not permit female succession in Hanover. Ernest became King of Hanover on the death of William IV in 1837, at which point Britain passed to Victoria and Hanover passed to him. He reigned in Hanover for 14 years, governing in the conservative manner of his German upbringing, and died in 1851 at the age of 80, survived by his son, and by the wife his mother had refused to receive. The closing of Ernest's life is the closing this story will not anticipate further here, because we are still in the years of his mother's life, and the years of her life are the story's subject. What we can say of Ernest, in the years between the early 1800s and his mother's death in 1818, is that he was the son she could not entirely receive, and who would not let himself stop loving her. That he was the son the country thought the worst of, and the son she defended in private without being able to defend him in full, and that he was, in the family's quiet internal accounting, the most loyal of all her boys, the one whose loyalty was hardest to bear because it asked her to give him back something she could not quite give. He was Ernest. He was a son. He had been a small boy in the nursery at Kew with a vigilant intelligence that the under-nurse had described to her mother in 1778. He had become a man who carried a scar on his face and a series of unprovable rumours in his name and the kind of fierce attachment to his mother that is most painful when it is not equally returned. The Queen carried him in the locked private compartment of her affections alongside Octavius's locket for the rest of her days. The matter of the brothers as fathers, in any sense the dynasty could officially recognise, was for most of the Queen's life a matter of absences. Frederick was childless. Edward remained without an heir until the very end. Augustus had 2 children whose legitimacy had been removed by the courts. Ernest did not have his son until 1819, after Charlotte's death. Adolphus became a father only after the race to the altar produced his eventual wife. The only one of the brothers who was indisputably a father, in the conventional sense of having produced and raised children, was William, with his 10 Fitzclarences at Bushey House. And the Fitzclarences were not children the Queen could acknowledge in any official capacity. The unofficial grandchildren, however, existed, and the Queen was their grandmother, and she was a grandmother to them in the only ways available to her, which were the small private acknowledgments that the 18th century court permitted to women in her position. The Fitzclarences received presents from her at Christmas. The eldest, George, was given a small horse on his 12th birthday. The second, Henry, received a watch on his 18th. The girls received pearls on their 15th birthdays, 1 each on a thin gold chain. None of these gifts came accompanied by a card from the Queen. The gifts arrived through Frederick, who took them to Bushey on his annual visits, and explained, in the gentle manner of an uncle who has agreed to do something delicate, that they were from Grandmamma, but that Grandmamma could not write them a card, and that they should not write her a thank-you note in return. The Fitzclarence children understood this. They were, by the standards of children growing up in a royal household not quite household, sophisticated about the unspoken rules of who could acknowledge whom and how. They received the gifts and they did not write notes. They mentioned their grandmother in their conversations with their mother. Dorothea Jordan, in her own private letters to William, described moments at Bushey in which the children would refer to the Queen as Grandmamma, and would speculate about what she looked like and what she would think of them if she could see them in person. Augustus's 2 children, declared illegitimate by the Court of Arches in 1794, grew up under their mother's name as Master and Miss Dest, the surname being one Lady Augusta Murray had constructed for them from a distant Italian ancestry on her father's side. They were raised partly by their mother in London, and partly by their father in his various continental retreats, and they received an education appropriate to their gentle birth, without the formal recognition of their royal blood. The Queen, as has been said, sent them small presents through Augustus, and did not receive them at court. She wrote to Augustus, on the occasion of his daughter Augusta D'Este's 15th birthday in 1816, that she trusted the child was being raised with the modesty appropriate to her position, and that she hoped Augusta d'Este would one day understand the difficulty of the circumstances surrounding her birth without bitterness. The letter survives. Augusta d'Este would, in 1843, after her father's death, attempt to claim her legitimacy under English law, and would be denied. She would marry well, however, to a successful lawyer named Sir Thomas Wilde, who would later become Lord Truro, and she would be received in society as Lady Truro, and would live in respectable retirement. She never met her grandmother. Charlotte never asked to meet her. Ernest's son, who would be born too late for Charlotte to know, would be one of the legitimate grandchildren produced by Charlotte's sons in the next generation, and he was born 6 months after her death. The Queen died in November 1818 with one legitimate granddaughter, Princess Charlotte of Wales, dead the previous November in childbirth, leaving no surviving descendant, and an unspecified number of unofficial grandchildren scattered across various of the unsanctioned attachments her sons had formed. She knew approximately how many there were. She did not know all of them by name. She did know the Fitzclarences. She did know Augustus's 2 destined children. She did know the existence of a daughter Edward had fathered in his early 20s by a previous mistress, before the long attachment to Madame de Saint Laurent had begun, and who was being raised in obscurity in Bath. She did not know the name of that daughter. Edward had not given her the name. He had told her only that the child existed and that he had made financial provision for her. The Queen had not pressed. The fact in the Queen's private accounting in 1815 or 1816 was that she had been the grandmother of perhaps 15 children, of whom she had been permitted to acknowledge none in any official sense, and that the dynasty for which she had borne and raised her sons did not, by the law her husband had passed in 1772, have a single legitimate descendant in the next generation beyond the one 21-year-old granddaughter, who was at that moment engaged to be married to Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, and on whom the entire future of the line therefore depended. She would have considered this fact when she allowed herself to consider it with a particular complicated grief. She did not allow herself to consider it often. The grief was too large to keep at the top of her mind for any length of time. She put it away in the locked compartment of her affections, alongside Octavius and alongside the careful unreceiving of Frederica of Solms-Braunfels, and she went on with the daily business of her household. The daily business was always there to occupy her. The grief was always there underneath. She lived by her 70s in the gap between the daily business and the grief, which is the gap most women of her age in any era have lived in, and she managed the gap with the resources she had, which were her embroidery and her gardens and her reading and her prayers and Frederick's weekly visits and the letters from Edward that arrived by every post. The king's mind broke for the first time in the autumn of 1788. It had been broken in small ways for some years before, with the irritabilities and the verbal eccentricities the household had begun to notice after the deaths of Alfred and Octavius, but the breaking that arrived in October 1788 was of a different order. The king had been ill in the summer with what the physicians had treated as a bilious complaint. He had recovered slowly, and not completely, and had returned to Windsor in October in a state of agitation that the Queen had recognised as not quite himself. He had been talking too fast. He had been speaking, in the household, of subjects that did not naturally arise. He had embraced an oak tree in the gardens at Windsor in early October, and had addressed the oak tree as the King of Prussia. He had, 2 weeks later, in the middle of a Privy Council meeting, fallen to the floor and had been removed to his bedchamber by his pages, where he had spent the next several days speaking continuously, for as much as 20 hours at a stretch, in torrent of language that the physicians attending him could not make follow any logical thread. The household at Windsor in those weeks was the worst household Charlotte had ever inhabited. She had no precedent for what was happening to the king. She had no advice from any of the women in her circle who had been through a similar thing, because none of them had. She had 3 physicians by his bedside who disagreed with one another about the diagnosis and the treatment. She had a husband who, when she went to him in his bedchamber, sometimes recognized her and sometimes did not, and who, when he did not, spoke to her as though she were a stranger who had been admitted to his rooms in error. The Prince of Wales, summoned from London, took up residence at Windsor and began, within days, to organise his political allies for the regency that would be required if the king did not recover. The Queen and the Prince, who had not had a substantial conversation in 5 years, were forced into one of the worst conversations they would ever have, in which the Prince informed his mother that he expected to assume the regency within weeks, and the Queen informed him that she expected the king to recover, and that any political preparations made on the assumption otherwise were premature, They quarrelled. They did not speak again, except formally, for the next 4 months. The king did, in the end, recover. He recovered slowly across the late winter and the early spring of 1789, and by the time Parliament had reconvened in February, the question of the Regency Bill had become moot. The king resumed his duties. He returned to Windsor. He thanked his wife in a private audience that survives in the household correspondence for her constancy through the months of his illness. He did not thank his eldest son for anything. He had been told, on his recovery, of the prince's political activities during the illness. He had filed the knowledge away. He would not, in the years that followed, raise it directly with the prince. He would simply not, in the years that followed, forgive it. The Queen, after that first breakdown, was a different person. The household understood. The king himself understood. The hair at her temples, which had been brown in October 1788, was grey by April 1789. The fine, careful patience that had been her defining manner across 30 years had a brittleness in it now that had not been there before, a sense that her resources had been spent more deeply than she could replenish them. She was 45 years old. She had buried 2 children, had borne 13 others, had managed a household across 2 countries and 40 residences, and had now spent 4 months watching her husband disappear inside himself and come back, and she had understood in those 4 months that he might disappear again and might not the next time come back. He broke a second time in 1801, briefly. He broke a third time in 1804, briefly. The third time he was returned to himself within weeks. The fourth and final time was in the autumn of 1810, on the occasion of the death of his youngest and favourite daughter, Princess Amelia, who had been chronically ill for years and who died at 27 on the 2nd of November. The king attended her on her deathbed. She gave him, as her dying gift, a lock of her hair set in a small mourning ring. He took the ring, he wore it. He never, in any sense he was capable of being aware of, returned from her death. The breakdown that began in November 1810 was complete and was permanent. He was declared, by the physicians who attended him, no longer competent to discharge the duties of the sovereign. The Regency Bill was passed in February 1811. The Prince of Wales became Prince Regent. The king was removed from public life. He was confined to a suite of rooms at Windsor, attended by physicians and keepers, and he would remain there for the next 9 years, in a state that the Queen could only occasionally bear to visit, and that the country was largely shielded from. He was blind in his final years. He was deaf. He spoke to people who were not in the room, and did not speak to people who were. He died on the 29th of January, 1820, 15 months after the Queen, who had died first. For the Queen, the king's final breakdown meant that the man she had married at 17, and to whom she had borne 15 children, was, for the last decade of her life, present in her household as a body without a mind. She visited him weekly at first. The visits diminished by 1814 to monthly. She found them unbearable. She could not, in any conversation with him, find the husband she had known. She would sit by his bed. He would speak, sometimes, in his old conversational manner, but the things he said were no longer connected to the room they were in or to the woman in front of him. He spoke to Octavius, who had been dead for nearly 30 years. He spoke to Amelia. He spoke to his own father, who had died in 1751. He did not speak to Charlotte. He did not, by 1815, appear to recognize her. She would sit with him for half an hour. She would kiss his hand. She would leave. She would weep in her carriage on the way back to her own apartments. She would, on her return, take up her embroidery and resume the daily routine that had been her support across all the years of the marriage. The marriage was the marriage. The marriage was, by the assessment that any reasonable observer would have made, over. The marriage was also, in the Queen's private accounting, the central fact of her life still, and she would not, in any document she ever wrote, refer to it as having ended. She became, in those years, the Queen who held the family together while the family fragmented. The regency that began in 1811 placed her eldest son, with whom she had been estranged for most of his adult life, in the position of head of state. She could not refuse to receive him. She did not refuse to receive him. She received him at Windsor and at the Queen's house and at the small private dinners she still hosted, and she was, in his presence, formally cordial in the manner she had always been. He, in turn, was formally respectful in the manner he had always been. They did not in those years become close. They became, however, mutually careful, in a way they had not been able to be when his father was active in the household. Charlotte was the only parent he had left. He was the king's nominal successor, which made him also the Queen's nominal protector. They settled into the polite distance of two people who had not been able to love each other in the way each had needed, and who had agreed, by the late stages of life, to behave decently in each other's company. The Queen, on his accession as regent, formally addressed him by his new title. She wrote him, on the 1st of February 1811, a brief note of formal congratulations and good wishes. He kept the note in his private papers. He wrote her, in reply, a brief note of formal gratitude. They went on. The regent's view of his own family, in the years he was regent, was the view of a man who had spent his whole adult life in opposition to the family's principles, and who, on coming into his inheritance, did not entirely know what to do with them. He had been a Foxite Whig in his youth. He had become, by his regency, a man who had quietly dropped most of his Whig views without ever quite saying so. He maintained his father's Tory government in office, to the consternation of his old Whig friends. He did not legislate Catholic emancipation, which had been the cause closest to his heart for 30 years. He spent extravagantly on architecture and on art. He continued to live, in private, with Maria Fitzherbert until 1811, when a final quarrel separated them permanently. He turned, in his regency, into the kind of monarch his father would, in his own better years, have despised, and into the kind of son his mother had, across decades, dreaded he would become. Charlotte, on her formal visits to him at Carlton House, did not say any of this to him. She had said nothing of it to him for 40 years. She continued, in the last decade of her life, to say nothing of it to him. She did, however, become more direct with the other sons in their middle age. She had earned by her 70s a certain freedom of address that she had not permitted herself at 25. She wrote to Frederick in 1812 that the army business he was conducting was being conducted with too little attention to the welfare of the common soldier, and that she hoped he would, in his next general orders, attend to the question of winter quarters in Spain. Frederick took the point. The general orders were issued. She wrote to William, in 1814, that the keeping of so many children at Bushey, without a clear plan for their futures, was an indulgence. William could no longer afford, and that the boys especially must be apprenticed to professions soon. William took the point. The boys were apprenticed. She wrote to Edward, in 1815, that his complaints about not receiving a peninsular command were unbecoming in a man his age, and that he should make peace with the army career he had, rather than the one he had wanted. Edward did not entirely take the point, but he stopped writing to her about peninsular commands. She wrote to Augustus, in 1816, that his Whig politics were perhaps not the cause closest to her heart, but that she respected him for holding them with consistency, and that she hoped he would not, on her death, give the family the trouble of publicly quarrelling with his elder brother. Augustus took the point. He gave the family no public quarrel, at least not in the years she was alive. She did not write to Ernest in any sustained way during the Regency years. Ernest was at Windsor, or in Hanover, or in Berlin, and he was the son she could speak to in person more easily than she could write to. She did not need to write to him. She did not write to Adolphus either, because Adolphus was in Hanover, and was, as ever, the son she did not worry about. The greatest sorrow of those last years arrived on the 7th of November, 1817. The Queen was at the Queen's house in London. She was attending to her correspondence in the small private sitting-room next to her bedchamber. A messenger had arrived from Claremont, the country house in Surrey where her granddaughter Princess Charlotte of Wales had been staying with her husband Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, and where the princess had gone into labour 2 days earlier with her first child. The labour had been difficult. The princess had been attended by Sir Richard Croft, the leading male midwife of the age. The labour had lasted over 50 hours. The child, a boy, had been born at 9 o'clock on the evening of the 5th of November, and had been stillborn. Princess Charlotte herself had appeared to be recovering through the night and into the next day. She had taken some broth. She had spoken to her husband. She had asked after her father and after her grandmother. She had, in the early hours of the 7th, begun to bleed heavily, and had been seized with convulsions, and had died at 2:30 in the morning, in her bed at Claremont, with her husband holding her hand and Sir Richard Croft standing at the foot of the bed. The messenger reached the Queen's house at 6 in the morning. The Queen was woken by Madame Schwellenberg. She received the news in her bedchamber. She did not speak for some minutes. She then said, in a steady voice, that those present afterwards remembered as belonging to a woman who had been preparing for this kind of news for many years, that the messenger was to be given breakfast, and that the household was to be informed at 7, and that the regent was to be sent for. She rose, she dressed, she wrote, in her own hand, the formal notes to her surviving children informing them of the death. She wrote the formal note to the cabinet. She gave instructions for the family's mourning. She did all of this before 9 o'clock in the morning. She then retired to her dressing-room and did not emerge until the early afternoon, when the regent arrived from Carlton House and she received him in her drawing-room. They sat together. They held each other's hands. The regent wept. The Queen, by the testimony of the lady-in-waiting present, did not weep, although her face had on it an expression the lady-in-waiting had never seen there before. The regent had lost his only legitimate child. The Queen had lost her only legitimate grandchild. The dynasty had lost, in a single night, its next generation. The political consequences of Princess Charlotte's death were immediate and brutal. The Prince Regent was 55, and his marriage to Caroline of Brunswick had not produced a second child and would not. Frederick, the next eldest, was 54, married to Frederica of Prussia, in name only, childless and certain to remain so. William, 52, was at Bushey with Dorothea Jordan and the 10 Fitzclarences, none of whom could inherit. Edward, 50, was in Brussels with Madame de Saint-Laurent, childless in the legitimate sense. Ernest, 46, was in Berlin with his wife Frederica of Solms-Braunfels, childless still. Augustus, 44, was technically unmarried under the law, and had 2 children declared illegitimate. Adolphus, 43, was unmarried. The dynasty had 9 adult sons of George III, 6 of them married legitimately or otherwise, and none of them with a living legitimate heir between them. What followed was the strangest passage in the long story of the Queen's motherhood. It became known in the family, as the race to the altar, and in some unkinder accounts as the Hymen's War, and what it meant in practice was that the Queen's surviving unmarried sons in their 40s and 50s were required, within months, to find German Protestant princesses willing to marry them in order to produce the next generation of the legitimate British royal line. The Queen, on her sickbed in the last year of her life, watched the race begin. She received reports of the negotiations. She received the candidates in formal audiences when they were brought to London. She approved, in her formal capacity, the marriages that resulted. She would not live to see most of the marriages take place. She would not live to see any of the children produced by them. The race went as follows. William's existing illegitimate household at Bushey was, in the spring of 1818, dissolved. Dorothea Jordan had already died in poverty in France in 1816, after a long sad decline that the family had not entirely behaved well in. The Fitzclarences were grown, mostly, by 1818. William, freed for marriage by Dorothea's death, was matched with Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, who was 25 and willing. They married on the 11th of July, 1818, in a double ceremony at Kew, in the same hour as Edward's marriage to Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, the elder sister of Leopold, who had been Princess Charlotte's widower. Edward's match was arranged with even greater haste than William's, because Edward was older and his fitness for fatherhood was the more uncertain. He had been required to dismiss Madame de Saint-Laurent. He did so. He arranged a pension. She retired to France. Edward married Princess Victoria. The double ceremony at Kew on the 11th of July was attended by the Queen, who was already ill, and who had been brought from Bath specifically to witness it, and who would give what would prove to be her last public performance as Queen at that ceremony. She wore black for the ongoing mourning of Princess Charlotte. She received Princess Adelaide and Princess Victoria in her drawing-room before the ceremony. She kissed each on the forehead. She told them, in the slow, careful English she still spoke after 57 years in the country, that she welcomed them into the family and that she hoped they would be happy, and that she trusted them, in particular, to be the kind of wives her sons required. The two new princesses curtsied. They were both, by the standards of the brothers' previous attachments, ordinary in their demeanour and dutiful in their manner. They would, in fact, both turn out well. Adelaide would be a kind and steady wife to William, and would bear him 2 daughters, neither of whom would live. Victoria, the elder, would bear Edward 1 daughter the following May, 8 months after his mother's death, a child the parents would name Alexandrina Victoria, and who would, in 1837, at the age of 18, become Queen of the United Kingdom. The Queen would not live to see that child born. The Queen would also not live to know that the next generation Hanoverian, on whom she had taken her own quiet bet, which was that one of her younger sons would, in this scramble, produce a legitimate child who would carry the dynasty forward, had won the bet for her in Edward's drawing-room on the 24th of May, 1819, 6 months too late for the Queen to see. Adolphus also married in the race. He married Princess Augusta of Hesse-Kassel on the 7th of May 1818, at Kassel, in a ceremony his mother did not attend because she was already too unwell to travel. They would have 3 children. Their daughter Mary Adelaide would be the grandmother of Queen Mary of Teck, who would marry George V, and the present British royal line descends through her. Cambridge was the son whose blood survived, as has been said, although Charlotte did not know it. Ernest was already married. He produced his only son George in May 1819 at Berlin, again 6 months after his mother's death. Augustus did not marry in the race. He had a wife in his own eyes already, in Lady Augusta Murray, who would not, until 1830, be replaced in his affections by Lady Cecilia Buggin, neither of whom the law recognised. Augustus declined to participate. The family did not press him. He had been declared by the courts to be unmarried under the Act of 1772 for 24 years. He was the dynasty's standing protest against his father's law. Frederick's existing marriage to Frederica of Prussia continued in its name-only form. Frederica had no intention of returning to England and producing an heir, and Frederick had no intention of asking her to. The two of them would remain married, in form, until her death in 1820, and Frederick would not remarry. The Prince Regent had been married once, disastrously, and his existing wife Caroline was alive and well in Italy. The Regent could not, by the law of the land, marry again while she was alive. He would not even attempt it. The race, in other words, depended on William, Edward, and Adolphus. All three married within 4 months of each other in 1818. All three would produce children in 1819 or later. The dynasty was, by the willing service of the Queen's 3 middle-aged spares, given its next generation, and the Queen had been the one to receive the 3 brides in her drawing-room and to give the family blessing. It was almost the last formal service she performed. She had been ill since the spring of 1818. The physicians had identified, in their characteristic euphemistic manner, a slow disorder of the chest and an irregularity of the heart. She had moved to Bath in late spring, on medical advice, to take the waters. The waters had not greatly helped. She had returned to London for the double wedding on the 11th of July, and had then returned to Bath, and had remained there through the summer and into the autumn, in a state of increasing weakness that her physicians could neither name nor reverse. She returned in October, not to London but to Kew, the small brick palace where her children had been raised, where she wished to be in the last weeks of her life. She arrived at Kew on the 10th of October. She did not leave it again. She had asked, on her departure from Bath, that her surviving children be informed that she would prefer to see them at Kew before the end. They came. The Prince Regent, now formally taking on the burden of being her eldest, was at Carlton House and visited her 3 times. Frederick was at Oatlands and came almost daily. William was at Bushey and came when he could. Edward was with his pregnant wife at Amorbach in Bavaria and could not come. Ernest was in Berlin with Frederica and could not, given his mother's refusal to receive his wife, come either. Augustus was in London and visited. Adolphus was in Hanover with Augusta and did not come. The daughters were the household around her. The Princess Royal had been married to the King of Württemberg since 1797 and was in Germany. Augusta, Elizabeth, Mary, Sophia were variously at Kew with her. Sophia, the daughter whose own difficult life had included the unrecognised child of 1800, was constantly at her mother's bedside in the last weeks. She read to her, she held her hand, she wrote, on her mother's behalf, the small notes to the family that her mother could no longer write. She was, in those last weeks, the daughter who provided what the Queen needed. The Queen could not, by November, walk. She could not, by the 2nd week of November, lie flat in her bed without difficulty in breathing. She was placed, on the orders of her physician, in a high-backed armchair in her sitting-room, surrounded by pillows. She slept in the chair. She received her visitors in the chair. She was attended in the chair by her senior ladies and by Sophia, and by the physicians. The Regent, on his last visit on the 16th of November, was alone with her for over an hour in the chair by the fire in her sitting-room, and what was said between them in that hour was not recorded by any member of the household. The Regent emerged with his eyes red. He returned to Carlton House that evening. He came back, on summons, the following afternoon. She died on the afternoon of the 17th of November, 1818, in the chair, in her sitting room at Kew, with the regent on one side holding her right hand, and Sophia on the other side holding her left, and Madame Schwellenberg standing behind the chair, and Frederick in the corner of the room, having just arrived from Oatlands at the gallop. She was 74 years old. She had been Queen of Great Britain for 57 years. She had borne 15 children, 2 of whom had predeceased her in childhood, and one of whom, Amelia, had predeceased her in young adulthood. She had outlived her only legitimate grandchild. She was the mother of a king-in-waiting and a crowded line of adult princes, 6 of whom had reached their middle age without a legitimate child between them. She had been, in the days before her death, the witness at her own family's scramble to produce the next generation that her husband's act of 1772 had made so improbable. She had blessed the brides. She had welcomed them into the household she was about to leave. She had not lived to see whether the blessings would produce the children the dynasty required. She did, in fact, know. She knew on the morning of the 17th before she died, because Edward had written from Bavaria that his wife Victoria was with child, and that the child was expected in May. The letter had reached Kew on the 15th. Sophia had read it aloud to her mother. The Queen had received the news in her chair, with her eyes closed, and had said only, in a voice the household could barely hear, that she was glad. She had not said which of her sons she was glad for. The household assumed she meant Edward. The household was probably right. She might also have meant, in the largest sense, the dynasty. She might have meant herself. The locket of Octavius's hair, which she had worn under her dress for 35 years, was found around her neck after her death. The household had not, in those years, ever seen it. Madame Schwellenberg knew it was there. The senior ladies of the bedchamber knew, by inference, that there was something on a chain around the Queen's neck under her dress, but they had not ever asked. The locket was taken from her neck after death. It was given to Frederick. Frederick kept it. The locket by some account eventually passed into the royal archives, and is, by other accounts, lost. The point of mentioning it again here, at the end, is that it had been there the whole time. The Queen, who had not, in 50 years of public life, been seen to weep openly for either of her dead small sons, had carried against her skin the only physical reminder of the second of them, every day from his death until her own. The funeral was held at Windsor on the 2nd of December, 1816. It was conducted with the full ceremonial of a state funeral for a queen consort. The regent attended, Frederick attended, William and Augustus attended. Ernest came from Berlin and attended. Adolphus came from Hanover and attended. Edward did not attend, being in Bavaria with his pregnant wife. The body was placed in the royal vault at Windsor, in the space prepared for her next to the spaces that would, in time, receive her husband and her sons in turn. The Prince Regent, who would in time succeed his father as George IV, and who would in turn be buried in the same vault, walked behind his mother's coffin in a state of barely held composure, and a number of those present afterwards remembered that he had looked, that morning, less like a 56-year-old Prince Regent than like a small boy whose mother had finally gone where he could not follow. The Reverend Markham was long dead. The nursery at Kew was long dispersed. The boys his mother had raised in that nursery were, that morning, standing in a row behind the coffin in the order of their births. The order by then had reorganized itself by the gaps left by the dead. George the Regent was first, Frederick second, William third, Edward was absent abroad. Ernest, with his scarred face, was fourth in the line of attendance. Augustus was next, with his standing protest against the Act of 1772 implicit in his presence. Adolphus, the easy one, came last. The 4 daughters present walked behind their brothers. The household followed. The king did not attend. The king was, in November 1818, in his rooms at Windsor, blind and deaf and beyond knowing that his wife had died. He would be told, in his lucid moments, that she had gone before him. He would not, by any account of those who attended him in his last months, retain the knowledge. He died 15 months later, on the 29th of January 1820, and was buried beside her in the vault. The story, for the story's purposes, ends here, but the story does not quite end. The sons went on. The Prince Regent became George IV on the death of his father in 1820. He reigned for 10 years, in a manner historians have not been generous about, and died in 1830, having outlived his only legitimate child and his estranged wife. He was succeeded by Frederick, except Frederick had died in 1827, 3 years before his elder brother, of dropsy, in his bed at Rutland House. The crown passed instead to William, who became William IV at 64 and reigned, with surprising competence, until his death in 1837. He left no legitimate child, his 2 daughters with Adelaide having both died in infancy. The throne passed, on his death, to his niece Victoria, the daughter of Edward, who had been born in May 1819 to the marriage Edward had made in the race to the altar. Edward himself had not lived to see his daughter on the throne. He had died in January 1820 of pneumonia 8 days before his father. He had lived just long enough to ensure that the dynasty had its heir, and the dynasty's heir was Alexandrina Victoria, who would reign for 63 years and would give her name to an age. Ernest, on the death of William IV in 1837, became King of Hanover by the operation of the Salic law that prevented Victoria from inheriting the German throne. He reigned in Hanover for 14 years, governing in the conservative manner he had absorbed in his German training, and died in 1851 at 80, in Hanover, in the bed he shared with the wife the Queen had refused to receive. His son became King of Hanover after him, until the Prussian annexation of 1866 ended the family's German throne. Augustus did not reign, and did not particularly wish to. He continued to live as a scholar in London until his death in 1843, having married Lady Cecilia Buggin in 1831, the second of his 2 voided marriages under the Act of 1772. Adolphus lived in Hanover as viceroy until 1837, and then returned to England as a private prince, in honourable retirement, until his death in 1850 at 76. His daughter Mary Adelaide, born in 1833, would marry the Duke of Teck, and would be the mother of Mary of Teck, who would marry George V in 1893, and the present royal line therefore descends, as has been said, through Adolphus, the son Charlotte had worried about least, in a piece of dynastic accident the Queen would have found, had she lived to see it, both pleasing and strange. There is in this house a particular weight that gathers when you sit by the bed of a child or by the chair of an elderly woman, and you understand that the work of being a mother was never going to end the way the work of other things ends, with a clear completion and a clear reward. The work of being a mother is the work of producing, of raising, of correcting, of receiving back, of releasing, and of failing, in particular small ways, the children you have given everything to. The Queen, who is the subject of tonight's evening, had done all of that. She had done it through 15 pregnancies, through 2 infant deaths, through the long disappointment of an eldest son who could not be reached, through the breaking of her husband's mind in 4 separate breakdowns across 22 years, through the loss of her only legitimate grandchild, through the late life rush to find German wives for sons in their 50s so that the dynasty might continue. She had done it, by every honest account, well, in the sense that she had not given up at any point and had given the work every day what she had to give. She had not done it well in the sense that she had not been able to give her sons what each of them, in his particular way, had needed. No mother in her position, at her time, with her resources, could have done so. The structure of the household had made it impossible. The act her husband had passed in 1772 had made it more impossible. The deaths and the illnesses and the long absences had made it more impossible still. She had done what was possible. She had done it for 56 years. She had died in a chair at Kew, with the eldest son she had loved at distance holding one hand, and the youngest daughter she had loved unreservedly holding the other, and the locket of the 4-year-old who had died in 1783 against her chest under her dress. Somewhere in the histories of every great family you have ever heard of, and every family you have not, there is a woman who has carried the weight of being someone's mother in a way the world did not entirely see. Sometimes that burden is recorded, sometimes it is forgotten, sometimes it leaves only a locket against a chest, seen clearly only after death. I would love to know if there has been such a woman in your own family, in the generations before you, whose work as a mother was the kind of work the world did not see, and whose private carrying you have only partly come to understand from the stories that were passed down. The burden does not, in the end, depend on being seen. It was still carried. The carrying is what made the dynasty Charlotte left behind. The carrying is what made, in the end, the British royal family of the next century, and the one after that, and the one we have now. The carrying was, in the simplest possible way, the work of a woman who had been sent across a sea at 17 to bear and raise sons for a dynasty, and who had done so, and who had been buried in a vault next to a husband who had been gone from his own mind for the last 8 years of her life, with a locket of her dead son's hair under her dress, where no one had ever seen it. The work continues, in some house in your part of the world tonight, in some woman you may or may not know. The work is the same work. The names change. Thank you, as ever, for spending the evening with me, and for sitting through the long story of a queen and her 9 sons. Good night.